The stagecoach was 4 hours late. That was the first thing Colton Mercer noticed when he stepped out of the livery stable and looked down the main road toward the eastern ridge. The sky had gone the color of dirty pewter by noon, and now, past 3 in the afternoon, it sat heavy and low over the valley like a ceiling caving in. He could smell the snow coming before he could see it, that particular sharpness in the air, dry and metallic and cold enough to sting the inside of your nose if you breathed too deep. He told himself the stagecoach was delayed by weather. It was a reasonable thing to tell himself. The Granite Pass Road was rough going in December, even under clear skies, and the clouds had been building since the night before. A smart driver would take it slow through the switchbacks. That made sense. That was probably it. He went back inside the stable, rubbed down his horse again even though she didn't need it, and listened to the wind beginning to pick up outside the wooden walls. 4 hours late became 5. By the time Amos Fitch came out of the post office and crossed the street toward the stable, Colton was standing in the doorway again, hat pulled low against the first scattered flakes of snow that were beginning to fall. Amos was the kind of man who wore bad news on his face before he opened his mouth. A long face to begin with, made longer by 20 years of frontier winters, and right now it was carrying an expression that Colton did not want to see. "Colton," Amos said, stopping a few feet away and pulling his coat tighter, "you ought to come inside somewhere warm." "I'm fine. I heard from a rider came through about an hour ago. He came over the southern pass, not Granite. Said the road up by Miller Creek is drifted bad. Said a stagecoach went off the road up there sometime this morning." Colton looked at him. The snow was picking up, coming down in earnest now, and it settled on Amos's shoulders and the brim of his hat, and didn't melt right away, which meant the temperature had already dropped below what the almanac had predicted. "Anybody hurt?" Colton said. He didn't know. Said it looked like the passengers had gotten out. He could see some tracks in the snow around the coach, but they weren't there when he passed. Weren't there where? At the coach. Amos rubbed the back of his neck. He figured they'd been picked up by somebody coming the other way, or maybe walked down to the Hennessy trading post on the western side of the pass. It's only about 3 miles from that stretch of road. Colton turned and looked up at the ridge. You couldn't see the pass from town. The mountains ate it long before your eyes could reach it. But he knew the country up there. He'd ridden it in spring and fall, knew where the road hugged the cliff face and where it dropped away into nothing on the south side. He knew how fast the temperature dropped at elevation when the wind got behind a storm. How long ago did that rider come through the pass? Maybe 4 hours? So if there were tracks around the coach 4 hours ago, those passengers have been out in this since morning. Amos pulled his coat tighter. "Storm's getting worse. Nobody's going up there tonight, Colton." Colton didn't answer that. He went back into the stable and started saddling his horse, Watch. Her name was Evelyn Hart, and she was 31 years old, and she had been writing letters to a man she had never met for the better part of 7 months. It had started the way these things usually started, not out of romance exactly, but out of practicality and a certain kind of desperation that she would never have admitted to anyone back in her life in eastern Ohio. Her mother had died in March. Her mother's house had gone to debts. Her job at the millinery on Crest Street paid enough to keep her fed, but not enough to save anything. And at 31, she had already outlasted most of the timelines that polite Ohio society had laid out for women of her situation. The advertisement had run in the Ohio Gazette in April. She'd clipped it without fully admitting to herself why she was clipping it, folded it small, and put it in the pocket of her everyday coat. She'd taken it out and looked at it maybe a dozen times over the following 2 weeks before she finally wrote the first letter. "My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 31 years of age, in good health, and reasonably educated. I am not what most would call a beauty, and I believe in being direct rather than presenting a version of myself that you will not recognize when I step off the stagecoach. If you are looking for a woman who will work hard, keep her word, and not pretend to be something she is not, I may be worth your time. If you are looking for something else, I wish you well in your search." She had read it over 3 times and decided it was too blunt, and then sent it anyway because she was too tired to write a softer version. His response had arrived 3 weeks later. "Miss Hart, I appreciate a letter that doesn't waste my time. I am 34 years old, have a son who is 6 and does not yet know what to make of the world, and have been running a cattle ranch in the Dakota Territory for going on 9 years. I am not particularly good at conversation, but I keep my promises and I work hard, and I will be honest with you. I am lonely in a way that is difficult to describe in a letter, And I think my boy is lonely too, in ways that a father cannot entirely fix. If you are still interested after hearing that, I would like to keep writing. She had read that letter 6 times. The letters had gone on through spring and summer and into fall, once a week on average, sometimes more when something happened worth telling. He described the ranch in a way that was more practical than poetic. Acreage, cattle numbers, the condition of the house, the water situation, the nearest neighbors and how far away they were. And she'd appreciated that he wasn't trying to sell her something. She'd told him about Ohio in the same way, the flatness of it, the way the sky sat closer to the ground than she imagined it did out west, the smell of the millinery with its bolts of fabric and hat forms, and the particular boredom of a life that had gotten very small. His son's name was Thomas. He was 6, nearly 7, and according to Colton, he was suspicious of new people, but once he decided he liked you, he would follow you around the property like a duckling. Colton had written this without any particular editorializing, but Evelyn had read it several times and found herself unexpectedly moved by it. She'd sold most of what she owned in October. She kept her mother's sewing kit, 3 dresses, 2 pairs of working boots, her grandmother's cast-iron thimble, and a small stack of Colton's letters tied with kitchen string. Everything else went to a woman on Maple Street who collected other people's objects and resold them out of her barn. The stagecoach out of Columbus left the first week of December. She changed coaches twice, once in Chicago and once in Bismarck. And the last leg of the journey, the one that was supposed to carry her into Harlo Creek, had picked her up 2 mornings ago at the Bismarck Depot in weather that was already turning. There were 4 other passengers in that last coach, a traveling salesman named Gerald, who smelled of bay rum and talked too much, a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who was going to visit a daughter in Harlo Creek and who had clucked disapprovingly at Evelyn's travel trunk, which was admittedly quite heavy. 2 young men, brothers by the look of them, who slept most of the way and spoke very little. The road had been manageable until they hit the climb toward Granite Pass. Evelyn had been looking out the small window, watching the snow thicken, when she felt the right rear wheel hit something. A rock or a rut, she couldn't tell. And then the world tilted, and there was a moment of pure silence before the impact. The coach went over on its side. She hit the door with her shoulder, and then Mrs. Aldridge landed half on top of her, and there was shouting and the terrible sound of the horses screaming, and then a kind of ringing stillness. Nobody was dead. That was the first thing she checked, working through each person methodically, which later she would recognize as an odd kind of calm that she'd never had occasion to discover in herself before. Gerald had a cut above his eye that bled dramatically but wasn't serious. One of the brothers had twisted his ankle. Mrs. Aldridge kept insisting she was fine while clearly not being entirely fine, pale and slightly glazed in a way that suggested she'd hit her head. The driver had been thrown from the box but was on his feet, limping, working to cut the horses free before they hurt themselves further. "We need to get to shelter," the driver said. His name was Holt. "There's an old line cabin about 2 miles east on a spur road. We can wait out the storm there." "How long will that take to walk?" Evelyn asked. "In this snow, maybe an hour. Hour and a half." She looked at Mrs. Aldridge, who was sitting in the snow with her knees drawn up and her eyes still not quite tracking right. She looked at Gerald, who was pressing a handkerchief to his forehead and looking at the snow as if it had personally offended him. She looked at the 2 brothers. "Can you walk?" she asked the one with the twisted ankle. "I'll manage," he said. And to his credit, he meant it. They walked. The line cabin was cold and dark and smelled of old hay and mouse droppings, but it had 4 walls and a roof and a stove that still drew, which was enough to be grateful for. Holt found a 1/4 cord of wood stacked against the east wall under a lean-to, half buried in snow, but dry underneath. He got a fire going. They sat around it for several hours while the storm outside went from bad to worse. Evelyn had her travel trunk. One of the brothers had dragged it out of the wreck before they left, and she had extra blankets and dry socks and a tin of biscuits she'd packed in Columbus for exactly the kind of emergency that nobody actually expects to have. She distributed these without comment and ate 1 biscuit herself. Mrs. Aldridge had recovered enough to be annoying again, which Evelyn took as a good sign. "How far are we from Harlo Creek?" Evelyn asked Holt. "From here? Maybe 10 miles by road. 6 if you go straight through the valley, but that's rough country. Is there another way down out of here? Another road? Holt looked at her sideways. Why? Because if someone is expecting me in Harlo Creek, they may not know we've wrecked. They may be waiting. Nobody's going anywhere in this storm tonight. What about tomorrow morning? Depends on the storm. She didn't push it that night. She tended the fire when Holt slept, kept track of the wood supply, and sat quietly in the dark, watching the others breathe and listening to the wind make its ugly sounds against the cabin walls. She thought about Colton Mercer, his face, which she had never seen, his handwriting, which she knew well, the way he described his son's habit of collecting smooth rocks from the creek bed and lining them up on the windowsill of the ranch house. She thought about the last letter she'd sent, the one he would have received a week ago, telling him her travel dates and the expected arrival of the stagecoach. He was going to be standing in the cold in Harlo Creek, watching a stagecoach arrive without her on it. She knew this as clearly as she knew her own name, and it bothered her in a way she couldn't quite account for, given that they had never met. Well, morning came gray and still blowing. Evelyn was awake before the others. She went outside into the cold before sunrise and stood looking at the sky, which was still delivering snow but lighter now, the worst of it past. She looked east, then south, trying to orient herself from what Holt had described. When Holt woke up, she asked him again. "The valley route," she said. "Is it passable?" He looked at her. "It's rough country, Miss Hart. There's a creek crossing that won't be fun in this weather." "But is it passable?" "For a person on foot who knows what they're doing, probably. I wouldn't send somebody who doesn't know the terrain." "Describe it to me." He studied her for a moment. "You're serious?" "I have somewhere to be. The others are fine. Gerald's fine. The brothers are fine. Mrs. Aldridge is fine. You're here, the fire's going. There's wood enough for 2 more days. Nobody needs me specifically to sit in this cabin and wait." Holt scratched his jaw. Outside, the wind gusted once, hard, rattling the cabin door, and then settled. "There's a ridge about half a mile south of here," he said slowly. "If you can get up to the top of it, you'll see the valley laid out below you. The creek crosses in 3 places. You want the lowest crossing? It'll be marked by a big split-trunk cottonwood on the east bank. From there, it's maybe 4 miles of open ground to the edge of town." "What do I need to watch for?" "Deep drifts on the north side of the ridge. Don't go through them. Go around. And watch the sky. If it closes back in and you're out in the open, find something to get under and stay there until it passes." Evelyn nodded. She wrapped herself in every layer she had. 2 wool dresses, her heaviest coat, a scarf she wound around her head, and the lower half of her face until only her eyes showed. She took her smallest bag, the one with the emergency supplies, and left the rest of the trunk in the cabin. "Miss Hart," Holt said, as she was pulling on her second pair of wool socks. She looked up. "You better be worth it," Holt said. She tied her bootlace. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's rather the point." She made the ridge in 40 minutes, which was longer than she'd hoped and shorter than she'd feared. The snow on the south slope was deep, and in places came up past her knees, and she fell twice, once badly, putting her hands out to catch herself, and coming up with snow packed into her sleeves to the elbow. She knocked it out as best she could, and kept moving. The view from the top of the ridge was remarkable in the impersonal way that dangerous things often are. The valley spread out below her, white and enormous, the mountains ringing it on 3 sides with their dark tree lines, and their white shoulders and the gray sky sitting on top of all of it like a lid. She could see the creek's dark thread far below, and the gap in the trees that she hoped was the cottonwood Holt had described. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. She started down the south slope. The descent was harder than the climb. Her legs were already tired, and the snow on the valley side of the ridge was wind-packed in some places and loose and deep in others, and she had no reliable way of telling which was which until she was in it. She went down slowly, testing her weight with each step, and twice the crust gave way, and she went into her thigh and had to work her leg free. By the time she reached the valley floor, she was breathing hard, and her feet were cold in a way that had moved past uncomfortable into something more concerning. She stopped, moved each foot deliberately inside her boot, felt the individual toes, and confirmed they were still there and still responding. Good enough. She found the cottonwood. It was unmistakable. Split at about 8 feet up into 2 major trunks, the wound in the wood gone gray with decades of weather. The creek crossing here was wide and shallow, a gravel ford that in summer would have been an easy wade. And even now, with the ice building at the edges, the center current ran fast enough to keep it from freezing solid. She picked her way across on the rocks, getting her right boot wet to the ankle where she misjudged the depth of a step, and came out on the other side swearing quietly under her breath. 4 miles. She counted her steps for a while, then stopped when it made the distance feel longer. She watched the sky instead, tracking the clouds, noting the places where the light seemed slightly stronger, which direction the remaining snow was blowing from. The wind had eased but hadn't stopped. Her wet boot was getting colder. She was not afraid, or not exactly afraid. There was a difference, she thought, between fear and awareness. She was aware that she was alone in a large amount of cold country with wet feet and a dropping temperature. She was aware that this situation had a finite number of good outcomes, and that the number of bad ones was larger. She held this awareness at arm's length, not because she was in denial about it, but because panicking in the middle of 4 miles of open valley would not improve anything. She thought about Colton Mercer instead. She thought about the letter he'd written in August, the one where he'd described a particular morning on the ranch, fog in the low places, and the cattle moving through it like ghosts, and his son running out in his nightshirt to look at them before Colton caught him and carried him back inside to put his boots on. He'd written it like it was nothing, like it was just a thing that happened, but she'd read it so many times the paper had softened at the folds. She thought, I am going to meet this man. She put one foot in front of the other. Colton was already on the road when the storm settled back in. He'd ridden out of Harlo Creek over the protests of Amos Fitch and 2 other men who had followed him to the stable and argued at him while he finished saddling his horse. He'd let them talk. He'd checked the cinch, confirmed his saddlebag had what he needed: rope, matches, a wool blanket, dried meat, a flask of spirits for medicinal purposes, and then he'd swung up and gone. You don't even know this woman, one of the men had called after him. He hadn't answered that. It wasn't an argument he felt like having. He knew the eastern road well enough to manage it in the dark, which was fortunate because the light was going fast by the time he cleared the edge of town. He kept his horse, a grulla mare named Cass, steady and sure-footed, at a careful pace, watching the ground ahead and letting her pick the route where the snow was deepest. She was better at that than he was. The snow was still falling when he hit the start of the climb toward Granite Pass. He stopped there and considered. The road up to the pass was the obvious route. It was where the stagecoach had gone, where the wreck presumably was. But the rider Amos had spoken to said the passengers had left the coach. If they'd been smart, they'd have taken shelter. If they'd taken shelter, they were in the line cabin on the eastern spur, which he'd used himself 3 winters ago when a late October storm had caught him bringing cattle down from the high pastures. But there was another possibility. If the mail-order bride who'd written him 7 months of letters was anything like the person those letters suggested, she might not have waited for someone to come to her. She might have looked at the valley and done her own math and decided to walk. Colton sat in the snow for a minute, listening to nothing in particular, his horse breathing steam clouds into the cold air. Then he turned south, off the main road, toward the valley. He almost missed her. That was the thing he would think about afterward, for years, that would occasionally wake him at 3 a.m. with his heart hammering. He almost missed her. He was riding the west edge of the valley, moving north, and the light was almost gone. The snow was picking up again, and the visibility had dropped to maybe 30 yards in any direction, everything beyond that gone to gray. He was watching the ground, watching for tracks, and Cass had her head down against the wind. He caught movement from the corner of his eye. Not much. A dark shape against the white, off to his right, maybe 50 yards. He might have thought it was a brush clump half buried in a drift. He might have ridden past it. He didn't. Cass turned at his knee pressure without being asked, picking her way through the wind-packed snow, and when he got close enough to see, he saw a woman on her feet, still moving, but moving wrong, slow and unsteady, her arms swinging out of rhythm with her steps, her head down in a way that suggested she was concentrating very hard on the act of walking and not getting it right. He swung down before Cass had fully stopped. "Hey," he said. She stopped. She turned very slowly and looked at him. Her face was wrapped almost entirely in a scarf, only her eyes showing. Those eyes were dark and exhausted and not entirely tracking right. That particular flat look he'd seen before in men pushed too far past their limits. Her right boot, he noticed, was soaked through and stiff with ice. Colton Mercer? She said. Her voice was rough, thickened with cold, and she pronounced his name very carefully, like she was reading it off a page.
Yeah, he said.
She stood there looking at him for a moment. Then she said, I'm Evelyn Hart. My stagecoach wrecked. She paused. I'm sorry I'm late. He didn't know what to do with that, so he took her arm and she let him, leaning into it with the controlled and slightly frightening steadiness of someone who is close to the edge but not there yet. Can you ride? He asked. I think so. Okay. He helped her to Cass. She got her foot in the stirrup on the second try and pulled herself up, and he swung up behind her and got his arms around her and turned Cass's head west. There's a cabin, he said, close to her ear so she'd hear him over the wind. About 2 miles. We can't make town tonight. I know, she said. I didn't think we could. He urged Cass into a careful walk. Evelyn was shivering hard enough that he could feel it through the layers between them, and her right foot was hanging loose from the stirrup because she couldn't bend it properly. He put one hand over that foot for whatever small warmth it added, and she didn't say anything about it. How long were you out here? He asked. Since this morning. Maybe 7 hours. A pause. The others are in the cabin on the east spur. They're all right. The driver's with them. I'll send someone for them in the morning. Yes, she said. She sounded like she was running on the very end of whatever had been carrying her all day, the last inch of the rope. That would be good. The snow came down around them and Cass put her head down and walked steady, and Colton kept his arms around a woman he had never met and who had walked 6 miles through a blizzard to reach him, and he did not say anything else because he couldn't think of anything that was worth the cold air it would take to say it. He'd used this cabin before, a different one than the East Spur cabin, this one northwest of the valley crossing, older and smaller, built by some trapper whose name nobody remembered anymore. He'd re-chinked the walls the previous spring for no particular reason, except that he didn't like to see things in disrepair. And he'd left a supply of matches in a tin above the stove, because that was the kind of thing that mattered when you needed it. The wood was under the lean-to out back, ice-crusted on the outside and dry within. He got it in 3 loads, breaking ice off the stove door with the heel of his hand, and had a fire going in 20 minutes. Evelyn sat in the only chair and did not complain, which worried him slightly more than if she had. He got her outer coat off and her outer layers, and then he got her right boot off, which required effort because the leather had stiffened as it froze. She made a small sound when it finally gave way. Her foot was not good. Not the worst he'd seen. He'd seen genuine frostbite that required amputation, which left an impression, but the toes were waxy and pale and not responding normally when he pressed them. He got the wet sock off, which was nearly frozen to her skin, and replaced it with a dry one from his saddlebag, and then wrapped both feet in the blanket and positioned her as close to the stove as was safe. Move your toes, he said. She tried. He could see the effort in her face. They're moving some, she said. Keep doing that. He heated water in the tin cup he'd brought. It was too small to do much, but it was what he had, and she drank it when he handed it to her with both hands wrapped around it. The color was coming back into her face, slowly. Your son, she said after a while. Thomas. Who's watching him? My neighbor's wife, Clara Hoskins. She's good with him. Does he know you came out here? He knows I went to look for someone. She nodded, turning the cup in her hands. He collects rocks, she said. From the creek. You mentioned that. Colton looked at her. Yeah, drives me half crazy. All those rocks on the windowsill. Don't move them, she said. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite humor but was adjacent to it, a dry, flat note that he recognized from her letters. Or if you do, put them back exactly the same. I've been doing that for 2 years. Good. Outside, the storm hit its second wind, pressing against the walls of the little cabin, making the fire in the stove pull differently. Inside it was still cold, his breath still showed, but it was survivable, which was the bar they needed to clear tonight. Just survivable. I need to tell you something, Evelyn said. He waited. I am not sure what I expected when I wrote that first letter, she said. I have thought about it a great deal on this journey, and I am still not entirely sure. But I want to be honest with you, because I have tried to be honest in the letters, and I don't want to stop now. She looked at the stove. I don't know if this will work. I don't know you, not really. Letters are not the same thing as knowing a person. No, he agreed. I am willing to try, she said. I think I have demonstrated that today. He looked at her. She was half wrapped in his blanket, still shivering, her hair half undone from its pins, her face chapped red from the cold. And she was looking at him with those dark, exhausted eyes, like she was waiting to see what he would do with what she'd said. I rode out into a blizzard for someone I'd never met, he said. I think I've demonstrated something too. She considered this. Then she said, That's fair. Get some sleep, he said. I'll keep the fire. You should sleep too. I'll sleep later. She looked at him for one more moment, then pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. Within 10 minutes, her breathing had evened out into something that was probably actually sleep, which he took as a good sign. She was warming up, her body letting go enough to rest. He sat across from her with his back against the wall, feeding wood into the stove one piece at a time, watching the fire through the grate and listening to the storm. He thought about Thomas, who was probably asleep in Clara Hoskins' spare bedroom with his smooth rocks in his coat pocket because he always put them there when he was worried about something and wouldn't admit it. He thought about 7 months of letters, the pile of them in the tin box in the desk drawer at the ranch house, and how he'd read the early ones enough times that he knew specific passages without meaning to. He looked at Evelyn Hart sleeping in the chair across from him, her breath rising and falling, color back in her face now, and he thought, okay, just that. Okay. Like something that had been uncertain was no longer quite so uncertain. Not resolved. Nothing was resolved. She was right about that. Letters were not the same as knowing a person, but shifted. In some way he didn't have words for yet, and didn't need to have words for tonight. He put another piece of wood in the stove. Outside, the storm did what storms do. It blew itself out through the long, dark hours of that December night, spent all its fury against the valley and the mountains and the walls of a small, forgotten cabin. And by the time the sky began to lighten in the east, it was running out of wind. Colton kept the fire. The light came in gray and thin through the single window of the cabin, the kind of light that doesn't so much arrive as seep, cautious and colorless, feeling its way across the floor. Colton had not slept. He'd come close, twice, that particular heaviness behind the eyes that pulls you under if you let it. And both times he'd shaken it off and fed another piece of wood into the stove and listened to Evelyn's breathing to confirm it was still steady. It was. She slept hard, the way people sleep when their bodies have made an executive decision on the matter, and she didn't move much, just the occasional shift of her shoulder or the sound of her pulling the blanket tighter without fully waking. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, the wind had stopped. Not gradually, it just stopped, mid-gust, like something had put a hand over it. The silence it left behind was the deep particular quiet of heavy snowfall, that muffled, padded stillness that sits on a landscape the morning after a big storm. Colton got up, opened the cabin door a crack, and looked out. The snow had stopped. The sky was still overcast but lighter in the east, and the valley lay smooth and undisturbed in every direction, the drifts shaped into long curves by the wind, beautiful and indifferent. He closed the door and put more wood on the fire. Evelyn woke around sunrise, or what passed for sunrise that morning, a general brightening rather than any actual sun. She was disoriented for a moment, the way people are when they wake in an unfamiliar place, her eyes going to the ceiling and then the stove and then to him, and he watched her put it all back together, watched her face as she remembered. "Storm's gone," he said. She sat up slowly, testing. "My foot. How does it feel?" She moved it experimentally, rotated it. Her face did something complicated. "Better than last night. Still not right." "That'll take some time." He handed her what was left of the water he'd heated, lukewarm now, but better than nothing. "The others will need someone to go get them." "I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "How far are we from the East Spur cabin?" 3 miles, maybe a little more. I can make it in under an hour." "And town?" 4 miles the other way." She looked at the fire for a moment, and he could see her doing the same kind of practical calculation she'd probably been doing since yesterday morning. Resources available, distances involved, the best use of what was on hand. He recognized the habit because he did it himself. It was what kept you functional on the frontier when things went sideways. "Go get them first," she said. "I can wait." "You're sure?" "I'm warm. I'm sitting down. There's wood." She looked at him flatly. "Go get them." He made the East Spur cabin in 45 minutes, pushing Cass harder than he liked through the fresh snow. The relief on Holt's face when Colton arrived was the uncomplicated relief of a man who had spent a long night worried and was glad to be done with it. Gerald had indeed bled a great deal from his head cut, which looked more dramatic than it was. The brothers were fine, young and resilient in the way that young men often are in bad situations, the kind that bounces. Mrs. Aldridge was pale and quiet and clearly wanted very much to be somewhere else. Miss Hart, Holt said. Did she make it? She's at the Jansen cabin, Colton said. She's all right. Holt let out a long breath. I told her not to go. Yeah, she mentioned she had somewhere to be. Holt laughed, short and tired. That she did. It took another 2 hours to get the whole group back to Harlo Creek, Colton riding ahead to get help, 2 men from town coming out with a wagon and extra horses, the whole slow, cold business of moving 5 cold and battered people through fresh, deep snow on roads that hadn't been touched since the storm. He collected Evelyn on the way, helped her onto a horse, and watched her ride the last 4 miles into town with the particular upright and deliberate posture of someone who is not going to let anyone see how much something hurts. He rode beside her and didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything either, and that was all right. Harlo Creek had maybe 240 people, depending on the season and how many of the outlying ranches you counted. It was the kind of town that had everything necessary and very little else: a general store, a livery, a post office, a saloon, a doctor's office, a small hotel with 6 rooms, and a church that doubled as a meeting hall. It had the social economy of all small towns, which is to say that everything that happened to anybody was known by everybody within a matter of hours. Evelyn Hart stepping off a horse in front of Harlo Creek's only hotel on a December morning, frost-chapped and limping slightly, her hair coming down and her coat still salt-stiffened from the previous day's sweat. This was known within the hour. Dr. Nell Marsh was a small, sharp-faced woman of about 50 who had been practicing medicine on the frontier for 20 years and had arrived at a general philosophy of treating patients the way you treat livestock, practically, without excessive sentiment, and with the understanding that most living things will recover if you get out of their way. She examined Evelyn's foot in the hotel room while Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and Colton waited in the hall. You were lucky, Dr. Marsh said, pressing her thumb along the arch of Evelyn's foot with a methodical attention that was not quite gentle. I know, Evelyn said. 3 more hours and you'd have lost the 2 outer toes. I know that too. Dr. Marsh looked up at her. You're not going to make a fuss about this, are you? No. Good. She wrapped the foot in clean cloth with brisk efficiency. Keep it elevated when you can. Don't put your full weight on it for at least 3 days. I'll come back tomorrow morning. She stood, collected her bag, paused at the door. The man in the hall, she said. He rode out in that storm for you. I'm aware. Just making sure you knew. Dr. Marsh opened the door, nodded once at Colton, and went down the stairs. Colton came to the doorway. Evelyn was sitting where the doctor had left her, her foot propped on the end of the bed, looking at the wall with an expression he couldn't read. She said 3 days off the foot, he said. I heard. The hotel's not expensive. I have money, she said, not sharply, just factually. I planned for contingencies. He nodded. He stood in the doorway a moment more. Thomas is going to want to meet you, he said. Something shifted in her face at that. Not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to it. How does he know about me? I told him I'd been writing to a woman who might come stay with us. He didn't say much about it, but he started putting his rocks in a better arrangement on the windowsill about 2 weeks ago, so. She was quiet for a moment. Bring him by this afternoon, she said. If that's all right? Yeah, Colton said. That's all right. Don't. Thomas Mercer was 6 years old and looked exactly like his father, which was the first thing Evelyn noticed. The same dark hair and the same way of holding himself slightly still, watchful, not unfriendly, but not offering anything he hadn't decided to offer. He came into the hotel room holding Colton's hand and looked at Evelyn from the doorway with the frank assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend not to be evaluating you. This is Evelyn, Colton said. I know, Thomas said. You said. Evelyn regarded him from the bed, where she was still keeping her foot elevated on Dr. Marsh's orders. She did not make the mistake of being too bright or too eager. She did not exclaim over how handsome he was or how grown up. She simply looked at him the same way he was looking at her. "Your father says you collect rocks," she said. "Yeah." "What kind?" He considered this seriously. "Smooth ones, from the creek, but also ones with interesting colors sometimes. I have one that's got orange in it." "Jasper, maybe, or chert." He looked at her with renewed attention. "What's chert?" "A kind of stone, very old, made of the same stuff as flint. People used to make arrowheads from it." Thomas looked at his father, then back at Evelyn. "How do you know that?" "I read," she said, "a lot, because Ohio in the winter doesn't have much else to offer." Thomas processed this. Then he said, "We have a lot of books at the ranch. Pa doesn't read them much, but he has them." "I read them some," Colton said mildly. "Not much," Thomas said without any particular malice. He looked back at Evelyn. "Are you going to come to the ranch?" "I am, in a few days, when my foot is better." He looked at her foot, wrapped and propped on the pillow. "What happened to it?" "I walked through a blizzard." "How come?" "Because I had somewhere to be and the stagecoach wasn't going to get me there." Thomas considered this for a long moment, weighing it with the serious judgment of a person who is 6 and takes information seriously. Then he said, "Pa rode out in the blizzard, too." "I know," Evelyn said. "He found me." Thomas nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd been working through. Then he crossed the room, not asking permission, and climbed up to sit on the edge of the bed beside Evelyn's uninjured foot. He looked at her from close range with those watchful dark eyes. "I have 43 rocks," he said. "That's a lot." "I know all of them." "I believe you." Something settled in him. Whatever the assessment had been, she'd apparently passed it. He sat there swinging his feet off the edge of the bed, and Evelyn looked at Colton over the boy's head, and Colton looked back at her, and neither of them said anything. The 3 days became 4, because Dr. Marsh came back the second morning, looked at Evelyn's foot, and said it was improving, but she wanted another day before she'd put her name to the idea of anybody riding 4 miles on it. Evelyn accepted this with the grace of someone who recognizes an argument they won't win. She spent those 4 days in the hotel room and the small common area at the top of the stairs, and during those 4 days she met most of Harlo Creek, whether she intended to or not. Amos Fitch came by to apologize for telling Colton not to ride out, which she accepted simply because there was no percentage in holding it against him. Mrs. Aldridge came by to thank her for the biscuits and the dry socks, and to make several pointed comments about the irregularity of Evelyn's situation that Evelyn received without visible response. Gerald the salesman came by to show her that his head was healing, which she had not particularly needed to see, but tolerated. Clara Hoskins, the neighbor who'd watched Thomas, came by on the second afternoon and stayed for 2 hours. She was maybe 45, broad-shouldered, and direct, with the look of a woman who had done everything that needed doing for so long that she no longer had much patience for anything that didn't. She looked at Evelyn with the frank appraisal that seemed to be a regional characteristic, and then she said, "Colton Mercer is a decent man. Doesn't say much. Works hard. Has been alone too long. He mentioned something about loneliness in his first letter," Evelyn said. "Did he?" Clara seemed mildly surprised. "He must have decided you were worth being honest with." "That was my interpretation." Clara looked at her steadily. "This country's hard on women who aren't ready for it." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I imagine it is." "Are you ready for it?" Evelyn looked out the window at the snow-covered street, the dark line of the ridge against the sky, the enormous open country beyond the edge of town. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I walked 6 miles through a blizzard with a frozen foot, and I'm still here, so I think I have a reasonable chance." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Fair enough," and poured herself more coffee from the pot on the room's small table. Colton came by each morning and each afternoon. He didn't stay long. There was the ranch to manage, the cattle to tend, Thomas to look after, but he came, and each time he did, he stayed maybe an hour and they talked, carefully at first, and then less carefully, working through the gap between what you can say in a letter and what you can say to a person's face. The third afternoon, he came and found her attempting to stand at the window without putting full weight on her foot, which was a direct violation of Dr. Marsh's instructions, and she didn't even look slightly embarrassed about it. Marsh said, "I know what she said. I'm testing it. And? Better, Evelyn said. Still sore, but better. I should be able to ride tomorrow. Ooh. He pulled the room's single chair over to the window and sat in it backwards, arms across the back. Outside, two men were trying to extract a wagon wheel from a particularly deep drift in the middle of the main street, arguing about the best angle of approach. You don't have to come out to the ranch right away, Colton said. You could stay in town a while, get used to the area. Evelyn looked at him. Do you want me to stay in town a while? I'm saying you have the option. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I don't want you to stay in town, but I don't want you to feel Colton. She said his name the way she'd said it on the valley floor the night he'd found her. Carefully, deliberately, like she was reading it off a page, but also like she meant it. I did not travel 1,000 miles to stay in a hotel room in Harlo Creek. He looked at her. I will come out to the ranch tomorrow, she said. We will figure out the rest as we go. Thomas is going to follow you everywhere. I know, I'm counting on it. Something changed in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the softening that happens in a person's face when they've been bracing for something and realize they don't need to anymore. All right, he said. Tomorrow then. Outside, the two men had gotten the wagon wheel free and were now arguing about something else. The December light was going fast, the western sky turning deep gold behind the mountains, and the snow on the main street caught it and turned briefly, improbably warm. What? The ride out to the Mercer Ranch the next morning was 4 miles of terrain that told Evelyn a great deal about what her daily life was about to look like. The road left town heading northwest, dropped into a shallow draw, and crossed a creek on a wood plank bridge that needed at least 2 new planks, climbed back out through a stand of cottonwoods stripped bare by winter, and then opened onto a long rolling plain that went north toward a line of hills. The ranch house appeared about 2 miles out, a dark shape against the white, low and substantial, with a barn and several outbuildings and a set of corrals where a dozen head of cattle stood in the morning cold. It was not a pretty house. It was a working house, built for function rather than appearance, the wood weathered to a dark gray, the roof serviceable, the windows small to conserve heat. There was a porch along the front with a split-log bench that had seen better decades. The yard between the house and the barn was churned to frozen mud and snow. Thomas rode his own horse, a small bay gelding of patient temperament, and had not stopped talking for most of the 4 miles. He described the ranch in an order that seemed to reflect his personal priorities: the creek where he got his rocks, the spot in the barn where a cat had her kittens last spring, the fence post out by the north pasture that had a hawk living on it most mornings, the particular hill to the east that you could climb and see the whole valley from on a clear day. Evelyn listened to all of it. She asked questions when questions were called for and didn't when they weren't. Beside her, Colton rode and said very little, though she noticed him glancing at her occasionally in a way that was not covert so much as careful, like he was watching for something without wanting to seem like he was watching for it. She was doing the same to him, she knew. They came into the yard and she sat on her horse for a moment looking at the house, taking it in without judgment. She was aware this was not what some women might have hoped for. There were women who came west with certain pictures in their heads, pictures that the reality of the frontier was very good at dismantling. She did not have those pictures. She told him in her first letter that she believed in being direct rather than presenting a version of herself he wouldn't recognize, and she thought that went both ways. This was the house. These were the corrals and the barn and the frozen mud. This was the life. Good. Now she knew. She swung down from the horse, keeping her weight off the sore foot until she had the other one solidly under her. The guest room's at the back of the house, Colton said, dismounting beside her. It's the smaller one. That's fine. The stove in the main room is better than the one in the back, so it'll be colder at night until the house warms through. I have an extra blanket. Thomas had already slid off his horse and was standing on the porch, holding the door open with the particular impatient energy of a child who has been showing someone his kingdom and needs them to come inside so the tour can continue. There's something I need to show you, he said. Come look. Evelyn walked toward the porch. Her foot ached, but held. Thomas, Colton said. She just got here. I know, Thomas said, but she needs to see the rocks. Evelyn stepped up onto the porch, looked at the boy, then looked back at Colton. He's right, she said. I do. And she went inside. The weeks that followed were not easy, and nobody pretended they were. There is a particular kind of difficulty in learning to share a space with people you don't know yet, even people you want to know. The ranch house had a rhythm that Colton and Thomas had built over years, small habits and arrangements, and an understood order to things. And Evelyn's presence disrupted that rhythm in ways that were sometimes awkward and occasionally frustrating. She put things in different places without meaning to. She cooked differently than Colton expected, better in some respects, requiring more complicated cooperation in others. She had opinions about the efficiency of the morning chores that she expressed carefully but clearly, and Colton received these with a mixture of irritation and acknowledgement that was somewhat less graceful than it could have been. "You don't have to reorganize everything," he said one evening, about 2 weeks in, when he'd come into the barn to find she'd rearranged the tack room. "I wasn't reorganizing," she said. She was mending a bridle, sitting on a hay bale with the oil lamp hung above her, and she looked up at him without apology. "I was putting things together. Everything was mixed up." "I knew where everything was." "How? You had bridles in with the grain sacks." "I knew that's where they were." She looked at him for a moment. "Is this the tack room conversation?" "What?" "The conversation where I've overstepped and you need to tell me, but you're not sure how." He stood in the barn doorway, the cold coming in around him, and looked at her. She looked back, steady and slightly tired, the way she often looked in the evenings after the day's work was done, like she was running on honesty because she'd used up everything else. "Maybe," he said. "Tell me then." He came into the barn and sat on the other end of the hay bale. Outside, one of the cattle made a low complaint from the corral, and then was quiet. "I've had things a certain way for a while," he said. "I know it's not the best way, but it's the way I know." "I understand that." "I'm not good at this part," he said. "The adjusting. I'm better at just working." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm not particularly good at it either." She set the bridle down. "I'll ask before I move things. If it genuinely doesn't matter to you where something is, I'll put it where it makes more sense. If it does matter, you tell me, and I'll leave it." He thought about this. "That's reasonable. Most things are if you say them out loud." He looked at her sideways. "You're going to be like this, aren't you?" "Like what?" "Practical. All the time." "Were you expecting something different?" He thought about the letters. He thought about, "I am not what most would call a beauty, and I believe in being direct." "No," he said. "I suppose I wasn't." She picked up the bridle again. "The tack room is better this way," she said, not unkindly. "You'll see." He sat there a while in the lamplight, listening to the horses shift in their stalls, and he thought that she was probably right, and that this was going to be the shape of it, this working through, this negotiation, this occasional friction that came from two people trying to fit their different ways of doing things into the same space. It wasn't easy. It was also not the worst thing he'd experienced, not even close. Thomas appeared in the barn doorway, sock-footed on the frozen ground, which was not allowed. "Pa said no sock feet in the barn," Evelyn said without looking up from the bridle. Thomas looked at his father. "What she said," Colton agreed. Thomas made a face of theatrical suffering, retreated to the house, reappeared 30 seconds later with his boots on. He came and sat between the two of them on the hay bale and watched Evelyn work the bridle with focused attention, and after a while he said, "Can I help?" "Hold this part," she said, and gave him the cheek piece to hold steady. He held it. Colton watched. The lamp threw its small yellow circle of light in the dark barn, and the horses breathed, and outside the cold December stars were coming out above the Dakota Territory. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. By the time January turned the corner toward February, the rhythm of the house had changed. Not replaced, but expanded, adjusted to 3 people instead of 2. Thomas had indeed taken to following Evelyn around the property, which Colton had predicted, and which Evelyn bore with a patience that occasionally surprised him. She taught the boy things, not in a formal way, not sitting him down with a lesson, but in the incidental way of someone who explains what they're doing while they're doing it. She told him about jasper and chert. She showed him how to test the ice thickness on the creek before stepping on it by the sound it made when you tapped it with a stick. She explained, when he asked why the cattle needed different feed in the deep of winter than they did in fall. Thomas absorbed all of this with the serious attention he gave to things he had decided mattered. He also, around the middle of January, stopped calling her Miss Hart. Colton noticed but didn't say anything. He filed it away with the other things he'd been quietly filing. The way the house smelled different now, like someone else's cooking and the particular soap she used. The sound of her voice in the mornings before he was quite awake, talking to Thomas about something. The rock she'd found on the South Ridge one afternoon and brought back for Thomas's windowsill. An ordinary piece of granite that had a vein of white quartz running through it like a scar. He filed it away and let it sit, and slowly, in the way that things do when you stop trying to force them, it settled. February came in hard and stayed hard. The cold that settled over the Dakota Territory in the second week of that month was the kind that got into the bones of everything. The house, the barn, the cattle, the people, and made itself at home without apologizing for the intrusion. The thermometer outside the kitchen window dropped to levels that made practical demands. More wood, more feed, more attention to the small things that could kill you if you let them slip. A water trough left unbroken overnight. A calf born too early in the wrong kind of cold. A door left open 2 minutes longer than it needed to be. Colton had lived with this kind of winter long enough that he'd stopped feeling it as a specific event and had absorbed it instead as a condition, the way you absorb any recurring fact about your life. He got up earlier, checked more things, moved a little slower because moving fast in deep cold was how you got hurt. He taught Thomas the same habits over the past 3 winters, the boy learning the rhythms of February the way he learned everything, by watching and asking questions until he understood the logic of it. Evelyn had learned fast. That was the thing Colton found himself thinking about with increasing frequency through those cold weeks, not with any particular sentiment, just as a plain observation. She had come from Ohio, from a flat state and a small indoor life, and she had stepped into a working cattle ranch in the middle of a Dakota winter, and she had learned fast. Not perfectly. She'd made mistakes, everyone did, especially in the first season. She'd underestimated the time it took to break ice on the water troughs, and twice left the job to Colton when she shouldn't have, not out of laziness, but out of misjudging the timeline. She'd badly overestimated the wood supply one afternoon, and they'd run low in the evening in a way that was uncomfortable rather than dangerous, but that she'd taken as a serious failure anyway, working through the problem afterward in a methodical silence that he'd learned meant she was angry at herself. He told her once that everybody miscalculated the wood in their first winter. She'd said, "That's not the point." He'd thought about that. "What is the point?" "I should have counted better," she said. "I'll count better." And she had. It was in the 3rd week of February that the trouble arrived, though it came quietly enough that Colton almost didn't recognize it as trouble at first. The man's name was Aldous Fry, and he came up the ranch road on a gray horse on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had risen just enough to make the cold feel almost reasonable. He was maybe 50, dressed well for the frontier, good coat, good boots, the kind of equipment that costs money, and he had the practiced manner of a man who spent a great deal of time managing how he came across to people. He smiled easily. He held his hands where you could see them. Colton watched him come up the road from the kitchen window and felt the particular stillness in himself that he associated with things he didn't yet understand. He went out to meet him before the man reached the porch. "Colton Mercer?" the man said, pulling up his horse. "That's right. My name is Aldous Fry. I'm a land agent out of Bismarck." He reached into his coat and produced a card which Colton took and looked at. It said exactly what the man had said it would say. "I'd like to talk with you about your grazing allotment on the north section, if you have a few minutes." Colton looked up from the card. "What about it?" "There's been a question raised about the original filing on that parcel. Nothing alarming, just a clerical matter that needs to be sorted out." He smiled again. "I find these things are much easier to discuss inside if you're willing." Colton considered this. He was aware of Evelyn in the kitchen behind him. He'd heard her stop moving when the horse came up the road, and of Thomas somewhere in the barn, which was out of earshot. "All right," he said. "Come in." Aldous Fry sat at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee with the ease of a man who was comfortable in other people's homes, which Colton filed away as something to think about. Evelyn was at the counter with her back partially turned, doing something with the bread dough that was not quite convincing as her primary focus. Fry laid out his position in the smooth, organized way of a man who had delivered versions of this speech many times. The north section, roughly 400 acres of grazing land that Colton had filed on and used for 9 years, had been identified as part of a larger land survey conducted the previous summer. That survey had apparently found an irregularity in the original homestead filing. The precise nature of the irregularity was somewhat complicated, involving township lines and an 1876 survey correction that had never been formally reconciled with the original claim. What this means practically, Fry said, turning his coffee cup in his hands, is that the north section may not have been properly titled under your name to begin with, which would mean the land technically reverts to federal domain, at which point it becomes available for new claims. Colton sat across the table from him and looked at him steadily. I've been running cattle on that section for 9 years. I understand, and that's exactly the kind of thing I'm here to help resolve. There are options available to you. A revised claim, a purchase at the assessed rate, various... Who raised this question? Fry paused. A very small pause, professionally managed, but Colton saw it. The survey was conducted on behalf of the Territorial Land Office. That's not what I asked. Who raised the question? The Territorial Land Office operates... Mr. Fry. Colton put his elbows on the table. I have been filing my grazing allotments with the Bismarck Land Office since I first came out here. I have a copy of every filing in that desk. He nodded toward the corner of the room. Including the original claim on the north section, which was filed in 1874 under the terms of the Homestead Act and has been continuously occupied since that date. So I'd like to understand specifically what the clerical irregularity is and who identified it. Fry's smile had become slightly more effort. Well, the precise nature of it is fairly technical. Then explain it technically. The smile fell away, or rather it stayed in place but became something else, a held position rather than a natural expression. Fry reached into his coat again and produced a folded document. He laid it on the table. This is a copy of the survey findings. You're welcome to look them over. Colton looked at the document without touching it. From the counter, he heard Evelyn set down whatever she'd been holding. What is the assessed rate for purchase? She said. Both men looked at her. She had turned around and was standing with her arms at her sides, looking at Fry with a directness that made Fry blink. I beg your pardon? You mentioned a purchase option, at the assessed rate. What rate? Fry recovered. The territorial assessment values that parcel at, he consulted a small notebook, approximately $1,200. The kitchen was quiet. $1,200 was not an impossible number for a ranch that had been producing for 9 years, but it was a serious one. It was the kind of number that required planning, not a decision made across a kitchen table. And if Mr. Mercer declines to purchase, Evelyn said, then the matter will go to the land office for resolution, and the parcel would be available for new claims, Evelyn said. Yes, you said that. She looked at Fry with an expression that was entirely polite and entirely unrevealing. May we keep a copy of the survey document? Of course, that's a copy. And who would we contact at the Territorial Land Office if we had questions? Fry gave her a name that she repeated back to him to confirm, and he confirmed it. And then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Fry. We'll look this over." It was a dismissal, delivered so pleasantly that it took Fry a moment to recognize it. He looked at Colton. Colton looked back at him without particular expression. Fry stood, put on his hat, and showed himself to the door with the slight awkwardness of a man who had expected a different outcome. The sound of his horse going back down the road faded into the cold. Colton picked up the survey document and looked at it. I don't know enough about land law, he said. Neither do I, Evelyn said. Yet. She came and sat across the table from him and picked up the document herself, scanning it. There's a territorial land agent in town. Amos mentioned him last month, the man who does the deed registrations. Not Fry, someone else. Casper Doone, Colton said. He's been doing deed work here for 15 years. Do you trust him? He's honest. A little slow, but honest. Take this to him tomorrow, Evelyn said, setting the document down. And get your original filing out of the desk. All of it. Everything you have. You think there's something wrong with it? I think a man dressed like that doesn't ride 4 miles out of town in February for a clerical matter, she said flatly. I think someone wants that parcel, and I think that document is the tool they're planning to use to get it. Colton looked at the document on the table. He thought about the north section, the grass it carried in summer, The water access at the north end where the creek bent around the base of the hill. The fact that without it, his summer grazing would be cut by a third. He thought about the way Fry's pause had lasted exactly long enough to be a tell. "There's a name in that document," he said. "In the margin, second page." Evelyn turned to the second page. Down in the lower right corner, in smaller print than the rest, was a notation. "Survey commissioned by Harlo Valley Development Company." They looked at each other. "Have you heard of them?" she said. "No," Colton said. "I haven't." Casper Doone's office was in a narrow building wedged between the post office and a vacant storefront that had been vacant for 3 years, and it smelled of paper and coal dust and the particular dry mustiness of a room that contains a great many old documents. Casper himself was 60 or so, thin, with the slightly distracted manner of a man who lived primarily in records. He'd been doing deed registration and land documentation for this part of the territory since before it was this part of the territory, and he knew the filing history of most of the land within 30 miles, the way other men knew their neighbors. Colton spread the survey document and his original filing papers across Casper's desk the next morning, and Casper looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Evelyn had come with him. She'd left Thomas with Clara Hoskins again. Thomas had objected, and she'd told him she'd bring him a stick of peppermint from the general store, and he'd reconsidered his position. And she sat in the chair beside Colton across from Casper's desk and watched the old man read. Finally, Casper said, "Where did you get this survey document?" "A land agent named Aldous Fry." "Out of Bismarck," he said. Casper looked at the name on the document. He looked at the margin notation. He turned back to Colton's original filing and read it carefully for the second time, then set it down. "Your original claim is clean," he said. "Filed correctly under the 1874 Homestead Act. Continuous occupation documented. No breaks in the record." "Then what's this survey about?" Colton said. Casper sat back in his chair. "The township line discrepancy they're citing is real," he said slowly. "It was corrected in 1877. But the correction was applied prospectively, meaning it didn't affect claims already on file before that date. Your filing predates the correction by 3 years. You're not affected. So the survey is wrong." "The survey is not wrong about the line discrepancy," Casper said. "It's wrong about the implication. Selectively wrong, you might say." He tapped the margin notation. "Harlo Valley Development Company. Do you know who that is?" "We were hoping you might," Evelyn said. Casper was quiet for a moment. "I've seen that name twice in the last 6 months, both times in connection with land along the Northern Creek corridor. There are 4 ranches up there. Yours, the Billings spread, the old Kennedy place, and the Fremont homestead." He looked at Colton. "You're the first one they've approached directly, as far as I know. But the survey document they gave you, I'd want to see who else has received something similar." "What are they after?" Evelyn said. "Specifically." Casper considered this. "The Northern Creek corridor has the best year-round water access in this valley. If someone wanted to consolidate that corridor under a single entity..." He paused. "There's been talk of a railroad spur out of Bismarck, coming southwest. If that spur comes through this valley, the land along the creek becomes considerably more valuable than it is now." The room was very quiet. "How long have you known about the railroad talk?" Colton said. "A few months. It's not confirmed. It may be nothing." Casper looked at him over his glasses. "But someone apparently thinks it's something." Colton sat with this for a moment. 4 ranches. A land company no one had heard of. A survey document built on a real technical fact bent toward a false conclusion. And Aldous Fry, with his good coat and his easy smile, riding out on a Tuesday morning as if it were a routine call. "What do we do?" Colton said. "Document everything," Casper said. "I'll make certified copies of your original filing and record this survey document formally, which means any subsequent challenge has to go through the public record. I'll also..." He paused, pulled a piece of paper toward him, made a note. "I'll write to the Territorial Land Office and ask for the official position on pre-1877 claims and the line correction. That creates a record of the question being formally raised." He looked at Colton. "And you should talk to your neighbors. The Billings family, the Fremont homestead. If this company is moving on the corridor, they may already know about it, or they may be about to find out the same way you did." Evelyn was looking at the survey document. "The name on this..." "The commissioner. Aldous Fry. Is he registered as a land agent with the territorial office? Casper blinked. That's a good question. Because if he's not, she said, then this document has a different kind of problem. Casper looked at her for a moment with the considering expression of someone revising an initial assessment upward. I'll check the registry, he said. I have the current list from last fall. He went to a filing cabinet that lined most of one wall and spent several minutes going through it with the particular unhurried thoroughness of a man who trusted paper over memory. Colton sat still. Evelyn looked at the survey document and then at the window and then at the document again. Casper came back to the desk. Aldous Fry, he said, is not listed as a registered land agent in the territorial registry. What followed was not fast. Nothing involving land records and territorial offices, and the long, dry machinery of documentation moved fast, and Colton had lived on the frontier long enough to have made a kind of peace with the pace of official things. But it moved, and that was what mattered. He rode out to the Billings spread the day after the visit to Casper's office. The Billings family, Hector and his wife, Ruth, and their 3 adult children, who all worked the ranch, had received no visit from Fry yet. But Hector Billings was a man who distrusted smooth strangers on principle and received the information Colton brought with a grim and focused attention. Railroad spur, Hector said, turning the idea over. You really think that's what this is about? I think someone thinks it might be, Colton said. Whether it comes through or not doesn't matter if they can consolidate the corridor land before anyone figures out what they're doing. What do you need from me? I need you to talk to the Fremonts. And if anyone comes out here with a survey document and a story about a clerical irregularity, I need you to take it straight to Casper Dune and not sign anything. Hector nodded. What about the Kennedy place? The Kennedy homestead had been vacant for 2 years. Old Robert Kennedy had died in the fall of 1881, and his family had gone back east. The place sat empty, its claim technically still active but untended. Colton had thought about that on the ride over. If they can get the Kennedy claim through a false challenge with nobody there to contest it, he said, they don't need the other 3. They just need enough of the corridor. Hector was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance. Robert's daughter, he said. She went back to Minnesota. Married a man named Sorensen. I got a letter from her last spring. If Casper writes to her about the status of the claim, she could file for continuation of title, Colton said. It's not the cleanest solution, but it closes the gap. You worked this out yourself? Colton shook his head. Evelyn, he said. She thought through the whole corridor while I was getting Cass saddled this morning. Hector looked at him sideways. He'd met Evelyn twice in the weeks since she'd arrived. Once at the general store, and once when Colton had brought her to the Billings place for a Sunday dinner that Clara Hoskins had organized. Hector was not a man who gave quick assessments of people. Good woman, he said, finally. It was not effusive, but from Hector Billings, it was the equivalent of a substantial endorsement, and Colton took it as such. The Harlo Valley Development Company turned out to be harder to trace than a real company would have been, which was itself informative. Casper sent letters to 3 different addresses associated with the name and received back 2 responses that redirected him to other addresses, the kind of bureaucratic layering that tends to be intentional rather than accidental. He sent the same information to the Territorial Land Office in Bismarck, along with the question about Aldous Fry's registration status. The Territorial Land Office took 3 weeks to respond, during which time nothing happened that Colton could see, and everything was probably happening where he couldn't see it. Evelyn used those 3 weeks. She wrote letters, organized, precise, factual letters, to 4 different parties. The Territorial Land Commissioner, a lawyer in Bismarck that Casper recommended, the County Records Office, and a man named Harwell Crane, who wrote for the Bismarck Tribune and had, according to Casper, a demonstrated interest in land fraud cases. She did not send those letters without showing them to Colton first, and he read each one and suggested 2 changes across all 4, which she incorporated, and then she sent them. You've done this kind of thing before, he said, watching her seal the last envelope. I've written a great many letters, she said. That's not what I mean. She looked at him. My mother spent 4 years trying to recover a debt from a business that had reorganized itself under a different name to avoid its creditors, she said. I helped her with the correspondence. We didn't win, but I learned a great deal about how these things work. She pressed the seal down. The basic principle is the same. You create a written record of every question and every answer. You make sure the record is held by more than one party, and you make it more trouble to continue the fraud than to stop it. He thought about that. Did it work? With your mother's debt? No, Evelyn said. But the situation here is different. Here we have a clean original filing, a documented irregularity in the challenger's registration, and multiple affected parties who are paying attention. She set the envelope on the pile with the others. And I'm better at it now than I was then. There was something in her voice when she said that. Not bitterness exactly, but the particular flatness of a person describing a loss they've made peace with. He thought about her mother's house going to debts, the millinery job, the small Ohio life she'd described in her early letters. He thought about what it cost to carry things like that and keep moving. He didn't say anything about it. He wasn't sure she'd want him to, and he'd learned enough about how she worked to know that there were things she'd hand him voluntarily when she was ready and things that required patience. He picked up the letters instead. I'll take these to the post office this afternoon. Take Thomas, she said. He's been inside all morning, and he's getting a particular look. What look? The one where he starts finding things to disassemble. Colton looked towards the back of the house, where Thomas was currently out of sight and suspiciously quiet. He took the letters and put his coat on. Chad. The response from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Wednesday in early March, when the cold had finally begun to lose its certainty and the daylight was noticeably longer than it had been a month ago. Colton was in the barn when Evelyn came out with the letter, and he knew from the way she was walking that it was something worth stopping work for. She read it aloud, standing in the barn doorway with the light behind her. It was written in the careful, bureaucratic language of official correspondence, but the substance of it was clear. Aldous Fry was not a registered territorial land agent. The survey document he had presented was not an official territorial document. The claim of an irregularity in Colton's original filing was not supported by the Territorial Land Office's records, which showed the filing as valid and uncontested. Furthermore, the Land Office noted that it had received inquiries from 3 other parties regarding similar documents connected to the Harlo Valley Development Company, and that an investigation had been opened. Evelyn lowered the letter. 3 other parties, Colton said. Casper, and the 2 other letters I sent, she said. Harwell Crane at the Tribune ran a paragraph about it 2 weeks ago. Did you see it? I saw it. That probably helped. He thought about Aldous Fry on his gray horse coming up the ranch road, his easy smile and his good coat, the document laid on the kitchen table with the margin notation in small print. He thought about the north section, 400 acres of grass and water that had been part of this ranch for 9 years, and that someone had decided to take by manufacturing a paper problem. It's not over, he said. No, Evelyn agreed. Investigations like this take time, and whoever is behind the company will try another angle. She folded the letter. But we have the official position on record, and they know we have it. It makes the direct approach much harder to sustain. From outside came the sound of Thomas appearing from around the back of the barn. He'd been given the job of filling the water troughs, and had apparently finished because he came around the corner dragging the water bucket and looking for the next thing to do. He stopped when he saw his father and Evelyn standing in the barn doorway with a letter. Did something happen? He said. Good news, Evelyn said. Mostly. Thomas considered this. What's the rest of it? More work, she said. He nodded, accepting this as the natural shape of things, and set down his bucket and came to stand between the 2 of them and look at the letter. Can I see? It's written for grown-ups, Colton said. I know how to read grown-up writing. I know you do, Colton said. That's not what I meant. Thomas looked at him, then at Evelyn, processing the distinction. Then he said, Is the ranch okay? Colton put his hand on the boy's shoulder. The ranch is okay. Thomas nodded. He picked up his bucket again. He looked at Evelyn. You figured it out, didn't you? It wasn't quite a question. We figured it out, Evelyn said. Thomas accepted this correction with the equanimity of someone who already knew the answer and had asked mostly to confirm. Then he went to refill the bucket, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, leaving Colton and Evelyn standing in the barn doorway in the March morning with the letter and the new particular quiet of something that had been genuinely threatening settling back into the category of manageable. The sun was fully up now, thin and still cool, but present in a way it hadn't been in months. Colton could smell the edge of something in the air. Not spring yet, not even close, but the faint suggestion that spring was somewhere in the future and heading this direction. He looked at Evelyn. She was still looking at the letter, her expression the focused and slightly unsatisfied look she got when a problem had been partially resolved but not entirely, when there was still more that needed doing. "Thank you," he said. She looked up. "For the letters," he said. "For thinking it through, for—" He stopped. He was not a man who was good with this part, and he knew it. "For being here." She held his gaze for a moment. It was a long moment, steady and quiet, and in it something passed between them that was not words and didn't need to be. "I had somewhere to be," she said. It was almost exactly what she'd said to Holt the morning she'd left the East Spur cabin and walked 6 miles through the snow. He recognized it. He thought she knew he would. He nodded once, and she nodded once, and they both went back to work. Spring came to the Dakota Territory the way it always did. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in arguments. A warm week followed by 3 days of hard frost. Mud that froze overnight and thawed again by noon, making every trip between the house and the barn a negotiation with the ground. The creek running fast and loud with snowmelt, carrying debris from the high country, depositing it in new configurations along the banks that Thomas cataloged with the attention of a small geologist. The investigation into the Harlo Valley Development Company moved through its phases with the grinding patience of official processes, which is to say it moved slowly, but it moved. Harwell Crane ran 2 more pieces in the Bismarck Tribune, one about the false survey documents, one about the unregistered land agent, and these had the effect that daylight generally has on things that prefer the dark. 2 men were eventually identified as the principals behind the company, a speculator out of Chicago named Declan Morn and a former territorial clerk named Vess Pruitt, who had enough inside knowledge of land filing procedures to construct the fraudulent surveys convincingly. They had, the Territorial Land Office eventually determined, sent similar documents to 11 properties along the Northern Creek corridor, but not just the 4 in Colton's Valley. The Kennedy claim had been their primary target, the vacant homestead with no one present to contest a challenge. But the letter Casper Doon had sent to Margaret Kennedy Sorensen in Minnesota had reached her, and she had responded by filing a formal continuation of title through a lawyer in Bismarck, which closed that gap before Morn and Pruitt could exploit it. Margaret had written a separate letter directly to Evelyn, whom she'd never met, thanking her for the warning. Evelyn had written back. They would correspond occasionally for years afterward. Morn and Pruitt did not go to prison, which was the frustrating reality of land fraud cases in that period. The law had enough teeth to stop them, but not quite enough to hold them for long. Morn paid a substantial fine, lost his land brokerage license, and departed the territory. Pruitt was barred from any future territorial employment and retreated to obscurity somewhere east of the Missouri. The railroad spur, when it was eventually built 2 years later, came through the valley on a slightly different alignment than anyone had anticipated, which meant the water rights along the northern corridor were valuable, but not transformatively so. Life rearranged itself around the new fact of the rail line and continued. What mattered practically was that the Mercer Ranch kept its north section, all 400 acres, clean title, undisturbed. Colton didn't celebrate this exactly. He went out to the north pasture the afternoon Casper sent word that the investigation had formally cleared his claim, and he walked the fence line for about an hour checking posts, which is the thing he would have done anyway. But he walked it with a particular attention that morning, feeling the ground under his boots, noting where the grass was already showing green at the roots under the dead winter cover, watching the creek catch the April light. He didn't tell anyone about the walk. He didn't need to. The question of marriage had been sitting in the background of the Mercer household all winter, with the patience of a thing that doesn't need to announce itself to be present. Neither Colton nor Evelyn had raised it directly. This was not avoidance so much as a mutual and mostly unspoken recognition that there were other things to get through first. The immediate practicalities of her arrival, the cold and the land fraud situation, and the business of learning to live in the same space, and that the question would surface when it was ready. In a town the size of Harlo Creek with its precise social economy, there were people who had opinions about the arrangement, and some of those opinions had been expressed in the form of meaningful silences or slightly too careful questions directed at Evelyn when she came to the general store or the post office. She received these with a neutrality that was not indifferent, but was also not defensive. The same directness she applied to most things, the flat acknowledgement that a thing was happening without feeling obliged to perform any particular response to it. Clara Hoskins had been more direct because Clara generally was. People are going to talk regardless, she told Evelyn one afternoon in late March, in the kitchen of the Hoskins place where Evelyn had come to return a cast iron pot she'd borrowed. That's just what people do. The question is whether you care. I care somewhat, Evelyn said, not excessively. What about Colton? He cares less than I do, I think, but he lives here and I don't want to make things harder for him than they need to be. Clara poured coffee. Outside, her husband Henry was doing something to a fence post with a hammer, the sound coming through the window at irregular intervals. He's a private man, Clara said. Always has been. He doesn't move fast on things he thinks matter. I know. Does it bother you? Evelyn considered this seriously, which was how she considered most things. Sometimes, she said. But I'm not sure slow is wrong. We don't know each other the way people who've been living together for years know each other. We know each other the way people who've been writing letters and then surviving a crisis together know each other, which is real, but not the same. She picked up her coffee. I'd rather do this right than fast. Clara looked at her over the rim of her cup. He's going to ask you, she said. He's just working himself up to it. I know that too, Evelyn said. Doughty. He asked her on a Sunday in early April, which was not planned, or not planned in any formal sense. They had ridden out to check the north fence line together, a practical task that had become a periodic habit over the preceding weeks, and they'd stopped at the high point of the pasture where you could see across most of the valley, the mountains still white-shouldered to the north, the lower country going green. Colton had been quiet for most of the ride, which was not unusual for him, but was a different quality of quiet than his ordinary one. Evelyn had noticed but said nothing, which was her own usual practice. They sat on their horses for a while looking at the valley. I'm not going to do this with a speech, he said finally. She looked at him. I've been trying to think of what to say and everything I come up with sounds like something I read somewhere. He looked at the valley rather than at her. So I'm just going to say it plain. I'd like to marry you. Not because it's the practical thing or because of what the town thinks. Because I want you here. Because the ranch is better and Thomas is better. And He stopped. I'm better. Since you came. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. A hawk was working the far edge of the pasture, riding a current of air, and she watched it for a few seconds before she spoke. The first letter I wrote you, she said. I told you I believed in being direct rather than presenting a version of myself you wouldn't recognize. I remember. I want to be direct now too. She turned to look at him. I came here to build something, not to be kept, not to fill a role, not to be grateful for the opportunity. I came here to be a partner in something real. She held his gaze. If that's what you're asking for, then yes. But I need you to know what you're saying yes to. He turned to look at her now, fully, and she looked back at him in the April light, the wind moving between them, both of them on horses on a hillside in a valley that was just beginning to remember what warmth felt like. I know what I'm asking for, he said. I've known since you told me not to move Thomas's rocks. She was quiet for one more beat. Then something shifted in her face. Not the release of something held, but the settling of something that had been looking for its place and found it. All right, she said. All right, yes, or all right, you're thinking about it. All right, yes, she said. I would have said if I needed more time. He nodded. He looked like a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time and had just set it down. We'll do it simple, he said. No fuss. Agreed. Thomas is going to be impossible about it. I know, she said. He's going to want to give me a rock. He already picked one out, Colton said. 2 weeks ago. I found it in his coat pocket wrapped in a piece of cloth. Evelyn looked at him. Then she laughed. A real laugh, sudden and genuine, the kind that surprises the person doing it. It was not the first time she'd laughed at the ranch, but it was the first time he'd seen it entirely unguarded, with no self-consciousness in it at all. He thought, there it is. They were married in the third week of April, in Casper Doone's office rather than the church meeting hall, because Evelyn had no interest in a ceremony sized for the town's entertainment, and Colton had even less. Casper, who was also a justice of the peace, performed the brief legal ceremony with the same methodical attention he gave to deed registration, which Evelyn appreciated. Clara Hoskins and Hector Billings witnessed. Thomas stood beside his father in a clean shirt that he'd complained about and kept tucked in through the whole proceeding through what was visibly considerable effort. Afterward, Thomas gave Evelyn the rock. It was wrapped in a piece of blue cloth, but Colton recognized it as a scrap from a shirt that had worn out the previous summer. And when Evelyn unwrapped it, she found a piece of dark basalt about the size of a hen's egg, shot through with a fine white crystalline vein that caught the light and broke it into small sparks. "It's feldspar," Thomas said, with the authority of a person who has researched the matter. "In the basalt. I looked it up in the mineral book." Evelyn turned it in her hands. "It's a good one," she said. "I know." He looked at her with those serious dark eyes. "You can put it on the windowsill with the others, or wherever you want. It's yours." She closed her hand around it. "I'll put it with the others," she said. "So it has company." Thomas considered this and found it acceptable. What followed was not a honeymoon in any conventional sense, because there was too much work for the season and neither of them would have known what to do with a honeymoon anyway. What it was spring on a working cattle ranch, the particular demanding beautiful chaos of calving season, the fence repairs that winter always generated, the plowing of the kitchen garden that Evelyn had planned on paper through February and was now executing with Colton's help, and a certain amount of disagreement about row spacing that they resolved eventually through a compromise that neither found entirely satisfying but that both could live with. The garden became, over the following weeks, something Evelyn managed largely on her own, which suited both of them. She knew plants better than Colton did. She'd kept a small kitchen garden in Ohio that had been productive in the constrained way that Ohio's shorter season allowed. And she applied the same systematic attention to the Dakota garden that she applied to everything, noting the soil's character, the drainage patterns, the way the light hit different sections at different times of day. She put in more than Colton expected, and he didn't say anything, trusting that she'd done the math. By midsummer, she'd put up more vegetables than they'd managed in any single year since Colton had come to the territory, and the excess became a regular contribution to the trading that went on among the families of the valley. Jars of preserved tomatoes and green beans exchanged for things the Mercer Ranch needed and didn't produce. A quiet economy of mutual dependency that was how the frontier had always worked at its functional best. Thomas had become, by now, her shadow in the way that Colton had predicted and Thomas himself would have denied. He helped in the garden with the same focus he brought to everything he'd decided mattered, asking questions that were occasionally inconvenient in their precision and that Evelyn answered without condescension. He was reading better by summer's end than he had been in spring, partly because Evelyn read to him most evenings when the day's work was done and had discovered that he would sit still for stories in a way he wouldn't sit still for lessons, and that the distinction between the two was mostly a matter of presentation. He did not call her mother. He called her Evelyn, which was what she told him to call her and which suited both of them. The shape of what they were to each other didn't have a perfect word, and that was fine. It was real, which mattered more than terminology. The community that developed around the Mercer Ranch over the following months was not something Evelyn planned exactly. It grew the way most real things grow, from a series of specific practical decisions that accumulated into a pattern before anyone had named the pattern. It started with the Fremont homestead. Ada Fremont was 26, recently widowed. Her husband John had died of a fever in February, 2 months before Evelyn's arrival, and was attempting to run 160 acres alone with 2 children under the age of 5. She was not failing at this exactly, but she was close enough to the edge that close observation would have confirmed the proximity. Colton had known the Fremonts for several years, the nodding acquaintance of neighboring ranchers, and he'd meant to check on Ada after John died, but the winter and the land fraud situation had consumed his attention, and he hadn't, which he told Evelyn with the direct admission of a man who has looked at a thing he wishes he'd done differently. "We'll go Sunday," Evelyn said. They went Sunday, bringing food and Thomas, and Evelyn had spent 2 hours with Ada Fremont, while Colton fixed a section of the Fremont barn roof that had partially collapsed under February's snow, and Thomas occupied Ada's children with such determined energy that he was clearly exhausted by the ride home. They went back the following Sunday, and the one after that. By midsummer, it had become a loose habit. The Mercer family at the Fremont place one Sunday, the Fremonts at the Mercer Ranch another. Clara and Henry Hoskins joined occasionally. The Billings family, who were a larger operation and somewhat more self-sufficient, came less often, but came. A family named Patrick, who had taken up a homestead at the south end of the valley, came once in August, and thereafter regularly. None of this was organized. There was no meeting called, no formal declaration of community building. It was just people with hard lives finding it slightly less hard to have neighbors who showed up, and that accumulating into something that had the weight and warmth of an actual thing. Evelyn understood this dynamic instinctively without making it into a project. She did not manage these gatherings so much as tend them, noticing when someone was quiet in a way that meant something, making sure the work that needed doing got done without it being assigned, having food enough for whoever came. She was not universally liked. She was too direct for some people's comfort, and there were a few women in Harlo Creek proper who found her manner abrupt in a way they discussed among themselves. She was aware of this and found she could accept it. You couldn't be all things to all people, and she'd never been particularly interested in trying. What she was, in the valley, was trusted. That had come more slowly and mattered more. 1. The summer of 1884 brought drought. Not a catastrophic one, not the kind that broke homesteaders and sent families back east, but a serious one, the kind that required decisions. The creek level dropped through July and into August, and the pastures on the south-facing slopes went brown earlier than usual, and the hay yield from the bottom ground came in low. Colton assessed the situation in the methodical way he assessed all situations. Cattle numbers against feed supply, water access points against creek levels, the cost of purchased hay against the cash the fall beef sale would generate. The arithmetic was uncomfortable. He'd need to sell some cattle early, younger stock he'd planned to carry through another year, to reduce the pressure on the feed supply. He told Evelyn his calculations one evening after Thomas was in bed, spreading his figures on the kitchen table in the lamplight. She looked at them. She asked 3 questions, the kind that identified the places where an assumption was doing load-bearing work that it might not be able to carry. He answered them, and in answering the third one realized that his estimate of the available water from the north section's creek bend was more optimistic than the current level justified. If you revise that down, she said, what does it change? It means I sell more, he said. Maybe 15 head instead of 10. She was quiet for a moment. The Fremonts are in the same position, she said. Worse maybe because Ada doesn't have the north section water. I know. If you and Hector Billings and Ada pool your hay purchase, the price per unit drops considerably. He looked at her. I know, he said. I was going to talk to Hector. Talk to Ada too, she said. She won't ask. No, he agreed. She won't. He talked to both of them. Hector had already been thinking along the same lines. Ada received the proposition with the careful dignity of a woman who needed help and knew it, and was not going to pretend otherwise, and said yes. They purchased hay together at a price that made the season manageable for all 3 operations. Ada carried it through. Her cattle went into fall in reasonable condition, and the calf crop the following spring was good, and by the end of 1885 the Fremont homestead was on a trajectory that looked like survival rather than slow failure. Ada Fremont did not forget this. She was not the kind of person who forgot things like that, and in the years that followed, she returned it in kind in the ways available to her. Help during the Mercer calving season, preserves when the Mercer garden had a bad year, the particular steady, reliable presence of a neighbor who showed up without being asked. Thomas turned 8 that fall, and then 9, and the boy who had been a small shadow became something with more edges, more opinions, more pushback, the early stages of a person developing the musculature of his own judgment. He argued with Colton about ranch decisions with a regularity that Colton found alternately impressive and maddening. And he had long conversations with Evelyn about things he was reading that ranged across a territory that would have surprised anyone who still thought of him as the quiet boy with the rock collection. The rock collection had grown to somewhere past 90 pieces. They occupied 2 windowsills and part of a shelf that Colton had built, and that Thomas maintained with a curatorial attention that Evelyn found privately amusing and publicly respectful. You're going to run out of room, Colton told him one evening. Then we'll need more shelves, Thomas said, in a tone that suggested this was obvious. Colton looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him with an expression that said, "You know where he gets that." He did know. It was not only from her. Thomas had always been his own particular person, but the precision, the assumption that a problem had a solution if you thought about it correctly, the absence of apology for taking up space. Those had been reinforced, over 2 years of daily life, by the example of a woman who operated that way herself. He was glad of it, on the whole. He was occasionally aggravated by it in the short term. Both things were true. The matter of the school came up in the autumn of 1884 and became the project that, more than anything else, fixed Evelyn's position in the valley's understanding of itself. Harlo Creek had no school. Children learned what they learned at home, from parents of varying capability and inclination, and the results were accordingly uneven. There had been talk of a school for several years, the same circular talk that happens when people agree on the need for something but can't organize the how. A school teacher required pay. A schoolhouse required materials and labor. The territory had a framework for common schools, but the mechanism required a petition and a minimum enrollment and a land donation for the building site. Evelyn spent October understanding the mechanism. In November, she started talking to people about it, not announcing a plan but asking specific questions. How many children of school age were in the valley? She counted 17, with 2 more expected before spring. What would families be willing to contribute toward a schoolhouse? She got answers ranging from labor to lumber to a flat refusal from 2 families who didn't see why they needed to pay for something they could handle at home. She wrote the petition herself, in the clear, organized prose of someone who understood that official documents needed to be exact without being complicated. Casper Dune reviewed it and suggested 2 changes. She made them, had it signed by the required number of landowners, which required her to ride to 4 different properties on 4 different days in late November when the weather was already turning, and submitted it to the Territorial Education Office in December. The Territorial Education Office approved it in February of 1885. The schoolhouse was built in the spring, on a 1/4-acre lot that Henry Hoskins donated at the south end of his property, near enough to the main road to be accessible from both directions of the valley. The labor came from 9 different families who showed up on 3 successive Saturdays and put up a serviceable single-room building that would hold 20 children comfortably, and 25 if nobody was particular about elbows. Thomas was 9 and in the first class. The teacher, a young woman named Frances Gould, who had come west from Illinois with more education than opportunity, arrived in September. She was 23, slightly terrified of the frontier in a way she managed admirably, and she had the particular gift of making children feel that learning was something they were doing for their own reasons rather than someone else's. Thomas was devoted to her within a week, in the uncomplicated way of a 9-year-old who has found a person worth being devoted to. Ada Fremont's children, who had had almost no formal schooling, blossomed in ways that made Ada cry once, privately, when she told Evelyn about it. Evelyn received this without sentiment, or with the particular sentiment that looks like absence because it's too full to spill over. She was glad about the school in a way that was partly for the children and partly for something harder to name, the satisfaction of a thing done, of a gap identified and filled, of a valley that was slightly more itself than it had been before. Colton had watched the whole process from close range. He had helped where help was useful, mostly in the physical labor of the building and the negotiation of the 2 families who'd initially refused to sign the petition. He'd listened to the evening conversations where Evelyn worked through the logistics out loud, not because she needed his input on all of it, but because he was there and the thinking was easier done spoken. He had not at any point told her what to do about any of it. He'd had opinions, and he'd shared them when she asked, and occasionally when she didn't, but this was hers. The idea of it, the structure of it, the particular determination that had driven it from conversation to reality over the course of a year, and he understood that clearly enough to stay out of its way. What he told her the evening after the school was finished and before the teacher arrived was simple. They were sitting on the front porch in the September evening, the light going gold, Thomas inside with a book. The valley was quiet the way it got in early fall, the frantic growth of summer done, the silence not empty but settled. "You changed something," he said. She looked at him. "In the valley," he said. "What it is. You changed it." She was quiet for a moment. "We changed it," she said. "Some of it was us," he allowed. "The school was you." She looked out at the valley, at the long gold light on the hills, at the dark line of the creek winding through the lowland. Her expression was the one she got when she was thinking something she hadn't fully worked out yet, or when she was looking at something she'd done and measuring the distance between what she'd hoped for and what had actually happened. "It's a school," she said. "It's not that complicated." "Most necessary things aren't," he said. "That doesn't mean they happen by themselves." She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back, and there was something in the look that didn't need to be said. An accounting, maybe, of the distance traveled, the ground covered since a December morning when he'd ridden into a blizzard for a woman he'd never met, and she'd walked 6 miles through snow for the same reason. She put her hand over his on the arm of the bench. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that in the September evening while the light finished its slow work on the hills, and the valley went quietly blue around them, and inside the house Thomas turned a page. The railroad spur came through the valley in the spring of 1886, 2 years after the Harlo Valley Development Company had tried and failed to consolidate the Northern Creek corridor by fraud. The rail line arrived not as the dramatic transformation that some had predicted and others had feared, but as a practical fact that the valley absorbed and adjusted to the way it absorbed and adjusted to most things, with a mixture of pragmatism and complaint and eventual accommodation. The depot was built at the north end of Harlo Creek, a modest structure of new lumber that smelled of pine resin all through its first summer. The cattle shipping that had previously required a 3-day drive to the nearest rail connection could now be accomplished in an afternoon, which changed the arithmetic of ranching in the valley in ways both obvious and subtle. Land values along the creek corridor rose, as Casper Doone and Harwell Crane and apparently Declan Morn had all anticipated, though not as dramatically as speculation had suggested. The valley was productive, but it was not the only productive valley in the territory, and the market had opinions about that. What the railroad actually changed, more than land values or cattle prices, was the speed at which people and things moved in and out of the valley. Goods that had taken weeks to arrive from Bismarck now took days. New families arrived more easily, and with less of the particular desperation that had characterized the early homesteaders, for whom the journey itself had been a kind of filtering. You had to want it badly enough to get there under the old conditions. The new arrivals wanted it, but differently, and the valley began a slow process of becoming something more varied than it had been. Colton watched all of this from the north pasture fence line, the same way he'd watched most large changes in his life. As a man who understood that the ground under his feet was the thing that mattered, and that larger forces moved through it but didn't replace it. The ranch was in the best condition it had ever been. 9 years of steady work had given way to 11 years, then 13, and the accumulated effect of that consistency showed in the infrastructure, the cattle quality, the state of the buildings. Colton had replaced the barn roof the previous summer with lumber purchased at the new depot rate, which had made it economically sensible in a way it hadn't been before. Evelyn's kitchen garden had expanded twice from its original dimensions, and now supplied not just the Mercer household, but a regular contribution to the Harlo Creek General Store, where Martin Foss sold her preserved goods with a markup that they had negotiated to a price both could live with. Thomas was 11, and the boy who had once needed to be reminded to put his boots on before going into the barn was developing into something that both of his parents watched with the careful attention of people who understand they are witnessing a process they don't entirely control. He was serious and capable and had a stubbornness about him that he had clearly inherited from both sides of his parenting, which occasionally made him difficult and more often made him effective. He'd started helping with the cattle decisions the previous fall, not as a learner being shown things, but as a participant whose observations Colton had begun to take seriously because they were serious. He still had the rocks. The shelves Colton had built had been extended once more, and the collection had passed 120 pieces, each one known and named and placed with a specificity that Thomas would have defended against any proposed rearrangement with considerable force. The piece of basalt with the feldspar vein, the one he'd given Evelyn on their wedding day, wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth, sat in the center of the main shelf. He'd put it there himself some months after the wedding, without saying anything about it. Evelyn had noticed but hadn't commented, and Colton had noticed that she'd noticed, and neither of them had brought it up. There are things that are more real for not being named. Shit. The first annual Valley Gathering happened in October of 1886, which was Evelyn's idea in the specific sense that she was the one who said out loud what several people had been thinking without organizing it into an action. The occasion that crystallized it was a conversation with Ada Fremont in late August, when Ada came by the Mercer Ranch to help with the last of the garden harvest. Ada's oldest child, a girl named Cora, was 7 now and had been in Francis Gould's school for a full year and had transformed in that year in ways that Ada described with a precision that was not maternal exaggeration but plain observation. Cora was reading at a level that surprised her teacher, had opinions about things she'd read, and had recently informed her mother that she intended to become a doctor. "Is that possible?" Ada said. Not skeptically, just asking. "Yes," Evelyn said without hesitation. Ada was quiet for a moment, pulling dried bean pods off their vines with practiced efficiency. "I couldn't have told her that a year ago," she said. "I didn't know enough to tell her that." Evelyn thought about this for the rest of that day and into the evening, after Ada had gone home and Thomas had gone to bed, and Colton was sitting with the ranch ledger at the kitchen table. She thought about what Ada had said, and about what it meant that a woman on a homestead in the Dakota Territory could tell her 7-year-old daughter that becoming a doctor was possible, and about how thin the margin was between that and the other thing, the smaller life, the pinched horizon, the answer being no before the question was fully asked. She thought about what had shifted in the valley over the 3 years since she'd arrived. The school, the cooperative arrangements around the drought year, the web of small dependencies and reliabilities that had formed among the families, the way people showed up now without needing to be asked because the habit had been built. None of it had happened because someone had a plan for a community. It had happened because enough people had made enough specific practical decisions, and those decisions had accumulated into something with weight. "We should have a gathering," she said. Colton looked up from the ledger. "In October. All the families in the valley, not for any particular reason except to be together and to know each other." She looked at him. "It's hard to maintain things you haven't named. If we have a gathering, it becomes something that happens every year, something the valley does. And that matters." He thought about this. "Where?" "Here," she said. "We have the space." He thought about the logistics for a moment, the number of families, the food, the practicalities of hosting several dozen people on a working ranch in October. Then he thought about the north section, 400 acres that they still had because enough people had known about the attempt to take it. He thought about Ada Fremont's cattle going into fall in good condition because 3 operations had purchased hay together. He thought about Francis Gould arriving in September of 1885 to a schoolhouse that existed because a woman from Ohio had ridden to 4 homesteads in November cold to collect signatures. "All right," he said. 31 people came to the first gathering, which was more than either of them had estimated and required a reorganization of the available outdoor space that Colton and Henry Hoskins managed with the improvised competence of men who have solved unexpected physical problems before. Tables were extended with planks from the barn. The food that everyone brought covered them, and then some, the surplus becoming the basis for a long and argumentative trading session in the afternoon that nobody had planned, and that turned out to be one of the more useful parts of the day. Thomas spent the gathering at the center of a loose group of children ranging from Cora Fremont at 7 to a 15-year-old Billings boy named Ray, who was old enough to be above children's activities and too young to be entirely comfortable with adults, and who therefore occupied the space between them with the particular ungainly energy of that transitional age. Thomas managed this group with the same focused attention he brought to things he'd decided mattered, organizing a rock identification contest that he had clearly prepared for in advance, and that was the only rigorously fair competition of the day because he was the only one who knew enough to judge it. Frances Gould came. She had been part of the valley's life for a year now, living in a rented room above the post office and walking to the school in the mornings, and she had settled into the community with the careful gratitude of someone who had not been certain she'd be welcome and had been pleasantly surprised. She arrived at the gathering with a pie and left 6 hours later having committed to teaching an adult reading class on Friday evenings, which had not been on her agenda when she arrived, but which had emerged from a conversation with 2 homestead wives who had asked about it with the same careful dignity that Ada Fremont had used when offered the cooperative hay purchase. Evelyn noticed this and filed it. There was a pattern in it that she thought about for some time afterward, the way people would ask for things they needed if the asking didn't require them to announce the need. The adult reading class ran through the following winter, attended by 9 people, and the winter after that by 14. Near the end of the first gathering, when the light had gone gold, and most of the food was gone and people were beginning the slow process of collecting children and plates and making their way to wagons, Hector Billings found Colton at the edge of the yard and stood beside him looking at the assembled valley for a moment before he said anything. "Next year," he said. "Yeah," Colton said. "Ruth wants to bring that venison preparation she does. Tell her to bring twice as much as she thinks she needs." Hector grunted, which was agreement. He stood there another moment. "Your wife," he said. Colton looked at him sideways. "Good woman," Hector said. The same 2 words he'd used 2 years earlier, the day Colton had come to tell him about the Harlo Valley Development Company. But this time, there was something added to them, a weight that hadn't been there before. Not more emphasis, just more underneath. The assessment of a man who'd had time to observe and had revised his understanding upward from an already positive starting point. "I know," Colton said. Hector nodded and went to find his family. The years accumulated the way years do on working land, not evenly, not without loss, but with the kind of continuity that you only recognize looking back. The drought of 1884 gave way to 2 good years, then a hard winter in 1887 that tested everyone and broke 2 homesteads at the south end of the valley, families who had come in later on marginal land with insufficient reserves. Colton knew both families well enough to help in the ways that were useful without making the help humiliating, which was a line that required some attention to walk. One family made it through, the other went back east in the spring, which was nobody's failure and everyone's sadness. Evelyn had her own losses in those years, the kind that don't make it into the official record of a life, but shape it as much as anything that does. A pregnancy in 1886 that ended at 4 months, quietly, without drama, and the particular private grief that such things carried on the frontier where there was no ceremony for them, and the work didn't stop. She and Colton talked about it once, directly, and without softening, the way they talked about most things, and then she filed it in the category of things that had happened and could not be changed, and she kept going because that was the only thing there was to do. Colton did not file it in the same way. He carried it differently than she did, in the specific manner that men on the frontier carried grief, not spoken of, not shown, but present in the extra care he took with her that month. The way he made sure the heaviest work was not hers, the way he came to bed a little earlier than usual for a while, saying nothing, just being there. She noticed this and did not comment on it, because she understood that it was what he had to give and that receiving it without making it complicated was the right thing to do. A daughter came in 1888, born in November in a situation that Dr. Nell Marsh managed with her characteristic blend of competence and minimal sentiment. They named her Ruth, after no one in particular. Colton had suggested it, and Evelyn had thought it suited the child, who arrived already looking like someone with opinions. Thomas, who was 13 and had been privately terrified for the weeks leading up to the birth, and would have denied this under any examination, held his sister for the first time with the expression of a person who has been given something they didn't know they wanted and is revising their understanding of what they need. "She's small," he said. "She'll get bigger," Colton said. "I know that." Thomas looked at the baby with a focus that was so like his father's that Evelyn, watching from the bed, had to look away for a moment because it was too much to look at directly. "I'm just saying, she's small right now." "Yes," Evelyn said. "She is." Thomas looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm tired," she said. "But I'm all right." He nodded slowly, accepting this. Then he looked back at his sister. "She can have rocks," he said, "when she's old enough to understand how to take care of them." Evelyn looked at Colton. He was looking at his son with an expression that had no name she knew, or maybe had too many. "That's generous," she said. "I know," Thomas said. He said it simply, without pride, just as a plain statement of fact. Guam. The gathering in October became the gathering that happened every October, one of those things that acquires the force of tradition before anyone has consciously decided to make it one. By the 3rd year, it had expanded to include families from 2 neighboring valleys who had heard about it through the rail network and the particular telegraph of frontier word of mouth. By the 5th year, it required planning that began in August, A loose committee that nobody officially appointed but that consisted in practice of Evelyn, Ruth Billings, Ada Fremont, and Clara Hoskins, 4 women who, between them, could organize most things that needed organizing. The gathering moved to the Harlo Creek Common Ground in its 6th year, when it had outgrown even the expanded Mercer Ranch Yard, and the town built a covered shelter for it the following summer, using the same cooperative labor model that had built the schoolhouse. Martin Foss at the general store, who was not naturally a sentimental man, made a small sign for the shelter that said Harlo Valley Annual Gathering, established 1886, and mounted it above the east entrance, which surprised everyone, including himself. Colton saw the sign on the morning of the 7th gathering and stood looking at it for a moment before he went in. Evelyn came and stood beside him. Established 1886, he said. That's when it started. I know when it started. He looked at the sign. It's just strange to see it written down like that, like it always existed. Most things look that way once they're real, she said. He looked at her. She was 41 now, with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd stepped off a horse in front of the Harlo Creek Hotel in December of 1883 and told him she was sorry she was late. Her hair had threads of gray in it that she did not attempt to conceal and had, he suspected, no particular feelings about either way. She had the look of a woman who had done a great deal of work for a great many years and whose body had an honest relationship with that fact, which was not the same as being tired. She looked at him, looking at her. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Come on. Thomas turned 21 in the spring of 1897 and announced at the dinner table, with the directness he had inherited from the woman across from him, that he intended to study law in Bismarck. The table was quiet for a moment. Ruth, who was 9, said, "What's law?" "Rules," Thomas said, "and how they work, and how to use them." "Why?" Thomas looked at his plate for a moment, then at his parents. "Because of the Harlo Valley Development Company," he said. Colton looked at him. Thomas had been 6 when Aldous Fry had ridden up the ranch road on his gray horse. He would have had no memory of it, or so Colton had assumed. "You know about that?" Evelyn said. "I heard you and Casper Doone talking about it when I was 9, Thomas said. "I didn't understand all of it then, so I looked up the land records when I was older. Casper let me see them." He looked at his parents steadily. "Someone tried to take this ranch by lying on paper. You stopped them by knowing how paper works. I want to know how paper works well enough that no one can do that to us or to anyone else in this valley." The dinner table was very quiet. Evelyn set down her fork. "Bismarck has a law college," Thomas said. "I've written to them. I can start in September." He looked at his father. "I'll come back. I'm not leaving. I just need to go first." Colton looked at his son for a long moment. He thought about the boy who had hidden smooth rocks in his coat pocket when he was worried about something and wouldn't admit it. He thought about the 13-year-old who had held his infant sister and said she could have some of his rocks when she was old enough. He thought about the 21-year-old sitting across the table from him now, steady-eyed, having clearly thought this through with more thoroughness than Colton had given him credit for. "You wrote to them already," Colton said. "I wanted to know it was possible before I said anything." Evelyn looked at Colton. He looked back at her. Something passed between them. Not a question and answer exactly, but a shared recognition, the kind that comes from years of being in the same room with the same person. "How much does it cost?" Colton said. Thomas told him. Colton nodded slowly, doing arithmetic in his head. "We can manage it," Evelyn said. "I know we can manage it," Colton said mildly. "I was calculating." "I know you were." She looked at Thomas. "September." "September," he confirmed. Ruth had been watching this whole exchange with the focused attention she gave to adult conversations when she sensed they were the kind that mattered. She looked at Thomas. "Are you going to come back and tell us about all the rules?" "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "There are some rules around here that don't make sense." Thomas looked at his parents. Colton looked at the ceiling. Evelyn looked at her plate with the particular expression she used when something struck her as genuinely funny, and she was deciding whether to show it. "Write down which ones," Thomas told his sister. "I'll look into it." The old line cabin in the Northwest Valley. The one where Colton had carried Evelyn through the snow on the night of December 1883 and kept a fire burning until morning, had been used sporadically over the years by ranch hands and passing travelers, and at least once by a family of raccoons who had found the stove inexplicably appealing. By 1895, it had begun to deteriorate in earnest. The roof leaked, one wall had developed a lean that suggested the foundation logs were going, and the door hung wrong on its hinges. Colton had been meaning to repair it for 2 years when Evelyn brought it up one evening in the fall of 1896. "I'd like to fix the cabin," she said. He looked up from the ledger. "The northwest cabin?" "Yes. It needs a new roof and probably a new sill log on the west side." "I know. I want to fix it properly." She looked at him in the way she looked at things she'd already thought through. "It should stay standing." He put down his pen. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. They fixed it the following spring, Colton and Thomas and Henry Hoskins on the roof and the sill work, Evelyn rechinking the walls with the methodical patience she brought to tasks that required attention over speed. Thomas asked, while they were working, how the cabin had come to matter. Evelyn told him, simply and without embellishment. The wreck, the walk, the frozen foot, the long night with the fire, and the man she'd just met who turned out to be who his letters had said he was. Thomas listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when something was worth listening to. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, nailing a new roof board into place with 3 precise strikes. "You walked 6 miles, he said. "About that?" "In a blizzard." "Yes." He thought about this. "Were you scared?" She considered the question honestly. "I was aware that it was serious," she said. "Whether that's the same as scared, I'm not sure." Thomas thought about this distinction for a moment, weighing it. "I think that might be what courage is," he said. "Being aware and going anyway." Colton, working on the sill log below them, heard this and said nothing. He drove a nail and let the moment be what it was. What is there to say about the passage of time that time itself doesn't say more plainly? The years moved through the Mercer Ranch the way seasons do. Some harder than others, some easier, none of them exactly what you'd planned for, and all of them exactly what they were. Colton turned 50 in 1899, which surprised him in the way that round numbers do when you arrive at them having been too busy to watch them approach. He was still lean, still strong in the specific way of men who have worked their bodies hard and consistently for 3 decades. But there were mornings when the cold in his hands reminded him that the body keeps its own accounts and presents them on its own schedule. He'd broken the same left wrist twice, once in 1877 from a horse fall and once in 1890 from a fence post that had come loose under load, and that wrist told him about weather changes with a reliability that he'd come to respect. Evelyn turned 52 in 1903, with the particular equanimity she brought to most of life's arithmetic. She was not a woman who spent energy on the passage of time. She had a life to run. Ruth was 15 and had, exactly as Thomas had predicted, developed opinions about everything, expressed with a directness that her parents recognized too well to argue with on stylistic grounds. She was also, Frances Gould had informed them the previous spring, the most able student the Harlo Creek School had produced, which Frances said without false modesty, because she thought the truth was worth saying. Thomas came back from Bismarck with his law certificate in 1900 and set up a practice in Harlo Creek, in the narrow building next to the post office where Caspar Doone had worked until his retirement the previous year. He was 25, serious, possessed of the same patient precision he'd brought to rock identification and land record review, and every other thing he'd decided to understand properly. He did the deed registration work that Caspar had done, and he took cases that other lawyers in larger towns didn't find worthwhile. Disputes over water rights, contested homestead claims, the bureaucratic tangles that the frontier generated in abundance, and that required someone patient enough to follow them through the paperwork. He was good at it, not in a showy way, in the way of someone who has found the work that matches how they think. His first significant case, in the fall of 1901, was a water rights dispute involving a new commercial outfit that had come into the valley with the railroad and was attempting to claim prior appropriation on a creek section that 3 homesteads had been using for 15 years. The commercial outfit had lawyers from Bismarck. Thomas had the documented history of the valley's water usage going back to the 1870s, because he had spent 3 years organizing Casper Doone's records into a coherent archive before the old man retired, and those records would have been lost. The homesteads kept their water rights. Colton heard about it from Amos Fitch before Thomas said anything, and when Thomas came for Sunday dinner that week, Colton looked at him across the table and said, "I heard about the Kellerman water case." Thomas passed the bread. "Casper kept good records. You organized them." "Someone had to." Colton looked at his son for a moment. Then he said, "You did good work." Thomas received this the way he received most direct statements from his father, with a nod that was not modesty exactly, but was the acknowledgement of a man who doesn't need more than what's given. "The records did most of it," he said. "The truth was in the records. I just found it." There is a thing that happens to people who have built something real together over a long time, something that is difficult to describe because it is not a single event, but an accumulation, a knowledge of each other that goes past words into the body, into habit, into the unremarkable daily texture of a shared life. Colton and Evelyn had been building this for 20 years by the time the century turned, and neither of them had a name for what it was because they had not needed one. It was just the thing they lived in. They still argued. They always had and they always would. About ranch decisions and money decisions, and occasionally about Thomas or Ruth, in the way that parents argue about children, even when the children are grown, each parent seeing a different true thing and neither wrong, and the resolution requiring them to hold both truths at once. Evelyn was still more direct than comfortable, and Colton was still slower to speak than she sometimes needed. And these were features of each of them that 20 years of marriage had not changed, and that each had learned to work with rather than fight. But there was something else alongside the arguments and the daily frictions and the ordinary fatigue of a life worked hard. Something that showed itself in the small, specific ways that real things show themselves. In the way Colton still brought her coffee in the morning, set it where she'd reach for it without looking, because he'd noticed 15 years ago where she reached without thinking and had adjusted to it. In the way she still asked his opinion on things she'd already thought through. Not because she needed his answer, but because she'd found that the conversation helped her see the part of it she'd missed. In the way they sat on the porch in the evenings, not always talking, not needing to. There's a particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to. It shows up in the small, persistent choices, the choosing again, every day, in the ordinary hours when there is nothing dramatic to prove anything. And it accumulates into something that neither the choosing person nor the chosen person could easily point to and name. It is less a feeling than a practice, less a state than a direction. Evelyn had written in her first letter that she believed in being direct, rather than presenting a version of herself that he would not recognize. She had meant it as a practical statement, a warning almost. The declaration of a woman who had been disappointed enough by the gap between presentation and reality that she had stopped being willing to participate in it. What she had not known, writing that letter, was that directness has its own kind of beauty. Not the beauty of the carefully presented, not the beauty of the smooth and cultivated, but the beauty of a thing that is exactly what it says it is. She had not known that a man who had spent 9 years alone on a working ranch would recognize that quality immediately and value it more than almost anything else. She had not known a great many things, writing that letter. She had not known about the boy with the rocks, or the North Section water, or the blizzard, or the long night in the cabin, or the valley that would become more itself because she had come to it. She had not known about Ruth or Thomas in his law office, or the gathering under the cedar shelter, or Francis Gould's adult reading class, or the school that had told Ada Fremont's daughter that becoming a doctor was possible. You never know, writing the first letter. That is the thing. You know only that you are tired of the life that has gotten too small, and that there is something out there that might be worth the risk of going toward it, and that you are willing to walk 6 miles through a blizzard if that is what the distance requires. The annual gathering in October of 1903 was the largest one yet, 63 people, by Thomas's count, which he did out of professional habit and reported to Evelyn with the same tone he used when reporting anything factual. The cedar shelter was full, and the overflow spread into the yard around it, and the sound of it, voices and children, and the particular noise of a large number of people who know each other well enough to be comfortable, carried down the valley in the October air. Ruth, who was 15 now and had decided opinions about how things should be organized, had taken over the afternoon portion of the program from her mother the previous year and had made it more structured, which some people preferred and others found excessive, and which Ruth had received feedback about with the exact same calm assessment that her mother received feedback she disagreed with. Colton found Evelyn near the edge of the gathering in the late afternoon, standing a little apart from the crowd, watching it. He came and stood beside her. 63, he said. Thomas told me. He was quiet for a moment, watching the crowd. He could see Ruth at the center of a group of younger children who appeared to be engaged in something competitive. He could see Thomas near the depot man, Harlo Creek's new postmaster, deep in a conversation that had the focused intensity of something legal or quasi-legal. He could see Ada Fremont talking to a woman he didn't recognize, new family, come in on the rail line last spring. Do you think about it? He said. December 1883. Evelyn looked at him. Sometimes. What do you think about? She was quiet for a moment, considering. I think about walking down that ridge, she said, the south slope coming down into the valley, how big it looked, how cold my right foot was. She paused. I think about the math I was doing, how far left to walk, how much daylight left, what the variables were. Were you scared? She looked at him sideways. It was almost exactly the question Thomas had asked her, working on the cabin roof. I was aware that it was serious. That's what you told Thomas. It's the true answer. He looked at the gathering, at 63 people who were here in part because she had walked down that ridge and he had ridden into the blizzard and they had found each other in the dark and kept a fire going through the night. Not entirely because of those things. There were many causes to any consequence, and the valley would have been something without them. But it would have been a different something, and he was not in the habit of pretending that individual choices don't matter because larger forces exist. I almost missed you, he said, on the valley floor. I was riding past. She looked at him. He'd never told her this before. Cass turned, he said. She felt me looking, or she saw something. She just turned. And there you were. Evelyn looked at the valley, the long golden October light on the hills, the dark line of the creek. She was quiet for a moment. I heard you, she said, before I saw you. I heard a horse in the wind and I stopped because I didn't know if I was hearing it or imagining it. She paused. I thought, if it's real, I'll hear it again. And I heard it again. He stood there with her looking at the valley they'd spent 20 years building, and he thought about the particular thinness of the margin, the moment on Cass's back when his eye had caught movement in the gray, the moment she had stood still in the blizzard and listened for what might be real. All the things that had come from those two small moments, the ranch in its best condition, Thomas in his law office, Ruth arguing with someone about the rules of something, 63 people under a cedar shelter in October, Ada Fremont's daughter who was going to be a doctor, the school, the letters to Margaret Kennedy Sorensen, the adult reading class on Friday evenings. He didn't say any of this out loud. He was not a man built for speeches, and this was not a moment that required one. What he said was, you should have told me about the ridge. When? Any time in the last 20 years. I'm telling you now. He put his arm around her, there on the edge of the gathering in the October afternoon. She leaned into it with the ease of a woman who has been leaning into the same thing for long enough that it is simply how she stands. That was a good horse, she said. Best I ever had, he said. Sold her offspring twice to people in this valley. I know. I kept the records. Of course she had. There is no clean ending to a real life, and this one is no exception. There are only the days that come after the days that have already come, each one carrying forward what the previous ones built. The Mercer Ranch would outlast them both, would pass to Thomas, who would pass it eventually to Ruth's eldest son, who had the same dark, watchful eyes as Colton, and the same directness as Evelyn, and who would stand in the north pasture one morning in the 1930s and feel under his boots the ground that his grandmother had fought to keep and that his great-grandmother had walked toward in the snow. But that is further along than this story needs to go. What this story needs to say is simpler, and it is this. There is a kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive on a white horse or speak in dramatic declarations. It looks like a woman writing an honest letter to a stranger and meaning every word of it. It looks like a man riding into a blizzard because the alternative, accepting that someone is gone without looking, is not something he can do and remain the person he is. It looks like a frozen foot kept moving because there is somewhere to be, and like a fire kept burning through the longest night because someone needs it. The frontier asks a particular question of the people who come to it. What are you actually made of when the comfortable things are gone? Not what you say you are, not what you were in a different life, what you actually are when it is cold and you are alone and the distance is real. Evelyn Hart had answered that question on a ridge above a Dakota valley in December of 1883, and the answer had been more than I knew. Colton Mercer had answered the same question that same night on a gray mare in a blizzard, and his answer had been the same. That is what the storm gave them. Not just each other, though it gave them that. It gave them the knowledge of what they were made of, tested in conditions that do not permit self-deception. And there is nothing quite like that knowledge. Not the comfortable kind, not the kind you arrive at in easy circumstances, but the kind you find at the end of 6 miles through snow with a frozen foot, or in the dark of a line cabin keeping a fire alive for someone you just met and already cannot imagine not knowing. They had built a life from that knowledge. A real one, imperfect in all the ways that real things are imperfect, full of the ordinary difficulties and occasional genuine hardships and daily, unglamorous labor that the frontier required. Full also of the things that came from doing it together, the specific warmth of a house that 2 people have shaped to fit their lives, the particular ease of a conversation between people who have argued honestly enough that they know each other's thinking, the way a valley looks when you have spent 20 years caring about it. The storm had nearly taken both of them. Instead, it had given them everything. That is the thing about the hardest nights. You do not know, going into them, what you will find on the other side. You know only that there is a fire to keep, and that someone needs the warmth, and that you are the one who is here. So you keep the fire. You keep it until morning comes, and then you find out what the morning holds.